He's so handsome, Piper Lowen whispered about Axel Jett, the Capo. Zane Thorne heard every syllable. His pen stilled mid-signature over a contract worth 8 figures. For 3 seconds, his sprawling corner office ceased to exist. No leather chairs, no city skyline 40 floors below, no empire, only those 3 words detonating in his skull like a grenade he couldn't defuse. He's so handsome. About Axel, his Capo, the man who worked for him, who owed him everything, who was now the object of Piper's breathless admiration. But what he didn't know was that someone was watching. Zane didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on the glass wall behind his obsidian desk, using the reflection like a sniper's scope. Piper stood near the outer reception, her cheeks flushed rose-petal pink, her hand flying to cover her mouth as if she could stuff the words back inside. And Axel, dark-haired, dangerous, too goddamn comfortable in his own skin, turned with a wolf's grin, one eyebrow arched in amused surprise. "Did I hear that right?" Axel asked, his voice carrying just enough to twist the knife deeper. In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. Zane's blood crystallized into ice, then ignited into something volcanic. He'd spent 11 months building an impenetrable professional fortress with Piper, 11 months of controlled distance and careful restraint, and she'd just demolished it with 3 careless words about a man who wasn't him. His jaw locked, his breath shortened. The fury that surged through his chest wasn't just jealousy, it was territorial rage, possessive and primal, and completely incompatible with the man who controlled a criminal network through calculated precision. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. He rose from his chair with the slow, lethal grace of a predator selecting its prey. "Miss Lowen." His voice cut through the office ambient noise like a scalpel through skin. "My office." Immediately. The professional boundary had been obliterated, and Zane Thorne was done pretending it had ever existed in the first place. The first time Piper Lowen destroyed her own carefully constructed safety, it was 9:17 on a Thursday morning. She'd done it with 3 words she hadn't meant to say out loud. She was standing near the espresso machine, just outside the glass wall that separated Zane Thorne's private office from the rest of the executive floor. Her tablet was tucked under her arm, balanced precariously against the leather portfolio she'd been carrying since 7 a.m., when Zane had texted her no greeting, no context, just conference room. 9:30. Bring the Castellano files. Her hair was swept into a professional chignon that had started the day perfect and was now threatening rebellion, small tendrils escaping near her temples. Her nerves were already frayed from the text, from the unreadable tone, from the fact that Zane Thorne's attention always felt like standing too close to a fire that could either warm you or consume you without warning. But this wasn't even the most shocking part. She was trying and failing spectacularly not to stare at Axel Jett. Zane's capo stood 3 feet away at the side counter, pouring himself black coffee from the French press he insisted on making himself because, as he'd once said with that infuriating smirk, "I don't trust anyone else to get it right." He was dressed in a charcoal Henley that clung to shoulders built for violence, sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms covered in ink serpents and Latin phrases and what looked like coordinates she'd never been brave enough to ask about. His dark hair was longer than Zane's, messier, pushed back from his face in a way that suggested he'd rolled out of bed looking exactly this dangerous. He held his mug in one hand, scrolling through his phone with the other, radiating the particular confidence of a man who knew he was good at what he did and didn't need anyone's validation. If you've ever felt powerless in a situation you didn't see coming, been caught saying something you can't take back, or watched your carefully built walls crumble with 3 careless words, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and comment where you're watching from. We're building a family of people who understand that one moment can change everything. Piper's coworker and closest work friend, Maya Chen, leaned closer and whispered, "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" Piper whispered back, not taking her eyes off Axel's forearms. "Staring. At the terrifying murder man." "I'm not staring." "You're absolutely staring. Your pupils are dilated." "He's so handsome," Piper breathed, the words escaping before her brain could intercept them. That moment, everything in the room changed. The phrase landed in the suddenly silent office like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Maya's eyes went wide as dinner plates. Her hand shot out to grab Piper's elbow in warning. But it was too late. The damage was done. Someone in the room was lying, but who? Axel stopped scrolling. He turned his head with deliberate slowness, his green eyes sharp, amused, far too knowing, locking onto Piper's horror-stricken face. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying that rough-edged drawl that made everything sound like innuendo. "Did you just—" "No," Piper said quickly, her face burning hot enough to set off the sprinkler system. I didn't mean to say that out loud. That was supposed to stay inside my head where it belongs with all the other inappropriate thoughts. Axel's grin widened, slow and wolfish. Inappropriate thoughts, huh? Now I'm curious. Maya made a strangled sound and tried to pull Piper toward the corridor. We should go. Right now. Immediately. He realized he wasn't alone, someone else had arrived. But Piper couldn't move, because the glass door to Zane's office was opening. Every muscle in her body locked down like a prey animal hearing the snap of a branch in the forest. Zane Thorne stepped out. For the first time, he wasn't in control. He was dressed in a three-piece charcoal suit that was tailored so precisely it looked like it had been grown on his body rather than sewn. No tie. He'd stopped wearing ties 2 years ago after telling Maya's predecessor that ties are for men who need props, but the white shirt beneath his vest was crisp enough to cut glass, open at the collar just enough to reveal the strong column of his throat. His dark hair was immaculate, not a strand out of place despite it being nearly mid-morning. His jaw was shadowed with stubble he maintained with the same ruthless precision he applied to everything else in his life, calculated, controlled, exactly as dark as he wanted it to be. But it was his eyes that made Piper's lungs forget how to function. They were brown, deep, dark, molten, and right now they were burning with something that made her knees feel unreliable. He'd heard. She knew it without confirmation. Knew it in the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, in the way his hand gripped the espresso cup he was holding like he was considering whether to drink from it or throw it. There was one detail everyone missed. He didn't look at her immediately. That would have been too easy, too merciful. He looked at Axel first, his gaze flat and lethal. Are we complimenting staff before 10 a.m. now, Jet? His voice was conversational, almost pleasant, which somehow made it more terrifying. Is this a new protocol I should know about? Axel had the audacity to smirk. Just observing the obvious, boss. Your secretary has excellent taste in... Don't. Zane's voice dropped 20 degrees. Finish that sentence. He trusted her, and that was his biggest mistake. Axel held up both hands in mock surrender, but the amusement never left his face. Consider it unfinished. Zane's attention shifted slowly, deliberately to Piper. His eyes moved over her face like he was cataloging every micro-expression, every flash of panic and mortification, and something else she desperately hoped he couldn't identify. Miss Lowen. Her name in his mouth always sounded like both a caress and a threat. Is everything satisfactory? This morning? Piper's mouth was desert dry. Yes, Mr. Thorne. Good. He took a single step closer, and the air pressure in the room seemed to change. Because I need you inside. We have the Castellano contracts to review before the 9:30 call, and I prefer not to be kept waiting. From here on, the rules of the game changed. He turned on his heel and walked back into his office, not waiting to see if she'd follow, because men like Zane Thorne never waited, they commanded, and the world rearranged itself accordingly. Maya squeezed Piper's arm hard enough to bruise. I'm so sorry, she whispered, then fled like the building was on fire. Axel watched Piper with that infuriating, knowing expression. For what it's worth, he said quietly, leaning close enough that she could smell coffee and expensive cologne. You have excellent instincts, but maybe keep them quieter next time. The boss doesn't share well. Please stop talking, Piper managed. See you at the meeting, Piper. He said her name like he was tasting it, testing its weight. Then he walked toward the conference room with the relaxed stride of someone who just lit a match and was curious to see what would burn. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. Piper stood frozen for 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, while her heart attempted to beat its way out of her chest. Then she straightened her blouse, gripped her tablet like a shield, and walked into Zane Thorne's office. The door clicked shut behind her with the finality of a cell locking. Inside, the air was different. Charged. Dangerous. Zane stood with his back to her, staring out at the city skyline, one hand in his pocket, the other still holding that espresso cup he hadn't drunk from. His shoulders were rigid beneath the perfect tailoring, his spine straight as a blade. He knew something that no one else in the building did. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, absolutely lethal. Tell me, Miss Lowen. He didn't turn around. How long have you been admiring my capo? And Piper realized, with sick, dawning horror, that this wasn't about work at all. This was about jealousy. His next decision would decide whether he lived or died, and she was standing in the blast radius. Piper's heels clicked against the polished marble floor as she crossed the threshold into Zane Thorne's office, each step feeling like walking toward an execution she couldn't avoid. The door closed behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss that sounded too much like a coffin ceiling. And suddenly the air in the room felt thinner, harder to breathe, charged with the kind of tension that preceded violence or confession or both. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. Zane still stood with his back to her, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city sprawling 40 floors below. His posture was perfect, shoulders squared, spine straight, one hand still in his pocket, while the other had finally set down that espresso cup on the glass side table. The morning light cut across his profile in sharp angles, illuminating the hard line of his jaw, the rigid set of his mouth, the way his eyes tracked something in the distance that she suspected had nothing to do with the skyline and everything to do with whatever was burning through his control. "Close the door completely," Zane said without turning around. His voice was quiet, conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "And lock it." And then, the gun clicked. Piper's hand trembled slightly as she reached back and turned the deadbolt, the metallic click echoing in the silence like a gunshot. "Mr. Thorne, I want to apologize for what happened out there. It was completely unprofessional and inappropriate, and How long?" Zane interrupted, still not looking at her. "I'm sorry? How long have you been attracted to Axel Jett?" He said the name like it tasted bitter, like it was a weapon he was testing the weight of before deciding where to aim it. But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. Piper's stomach dropped. This wasn't about professionalism. This wasn't about office decorum or maintaining boundaries between staff and executives. This was something else entirely. Something that made her skin feel too tight and her pulse hammer in her throat. That's not what. Don't lie to me, Miss Lowen." Zane turned then, slowly, and the full force of his attention hit her like a physical thing. His eyes were molten, dark and burning with something she couldn't name but felt in every nerve ending. "I've built an empire on reading people, on knowing when they're being honest and when they're performing. So don't insult my intelligence by pretending that 'he's so handsome' was a casual observation about a colleague's aesthetic qualities." What she said next shattered his trust instantly. "It was a mistake," Piper said, forcing her voice to stay steady even though her hands were shaking. "I didn't mean to say it out loud. It was just he was standing there, and Maya was teasing me, and the words came out before I could stop them. It doesn't mean anything, doesn't it?" Zane took 3 steps toward her, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them with the precision of a predator who knew exactly how to corner prey without making them bolt. "Then tell me, Piper and I want the truth. Do you find Axel Jett attractive?" The use of her first name sent a shock through her system. In 11 months of working for Zane Thorne, he had never once used her first name. It had always been Miss Lowen, always professional, always maintaining that careful distance that she'd told herself was protection, but had started to feel more like punishment. That's not an appropriate question for an employer to ask. For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. "I'm not asking as your employer," Zane said, and his voice dropped lower, rougher, stripped of the professional veneer he usually maintained. "I'm asking as the man who has spent 11 months watching you walk through that door every morning, who knows you take your coffee with 2 sugars and no cream, who knows you bite your lower lip when you're concentrating on something difficult, who knows that you're left-handed but you've trained yourself to use your right hand for most tasks because someone once told you it was more professional." He stopped less than 2 feet from her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and dark and entirely too distracting. "I'm asking as the man who heard you call another man handsome and wanted to put my fist through the glass wall between us." Piper's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Thorne, answer the question." "Piper." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made looking away feel impossible. "Do you find Axel Jett attractive?" Yes," she admitted, because lying suddenly felt more dangerous than honesty. "Objectively, yes, he's an attractive man. But that doesn't mean—" "And me?" Zane's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble. "Do you find me attractive?" Objectively, this choice would define the rest of his life. The question hung in the air between them like a grenade with the pin half pulled, and Piper realized with sudden, terrible clarity that she was standing in a minefield where every answer was wrong, where honesty would detonate something she wasn't prepared to handle and dishonesty would detonate something worse. "This isn't appropriate," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're my boss. I work for you. This conversation shouldn't be happening." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I can give you." Zane studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving over her face like he was searching for something hidden beneath the surface, some truth she wasn't speaking out loud. Then he stepped back, putting distance between them that felt both like relief and loss. "You're right," he said, his voice returning to that controlled, professional tone that she'd learned to recognize as his armor. "This conversation is inappropriate. Forgive me for overstepping." Piper exhaled slowly, feeling like she'd just survived something she didn't fully understand. "It's fine. Can I go now? I need to prepare for the 9:30 meeting." Actually, about that meeting, Zane walked back to his desk, his movements controlled and deliberate, every inch the composed executive again. "I'm pushing it to this afternoon, 3 p.m. instead, which means we have the morning to review the Castellano contracts in detail. I need your analysis on the liability clauses in sections 7 through 12. But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. "Those sections are straightforward," Piper said, confused. "I've already flagged the relevant concerns in the notes I sent you yesterday. There's nothing that requires additional review." "I disagree." Zane sat down in his leather chair, pulling the contract toward him with the calm authority of someone who didn't need to explain his decisions. "I want you to walk me through your reasoning on each clause. Sit." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Piper sat, opening her tablet with hands that still weren't entirely steady, and began explaining her analysis of liability structures she knew Zane Thorne understood better than she did. He interrupted her frequently with questions that had nothing to do with the contract had she reviewed the case law from the Second Circuit. What was her opinion on the enforceability of arbitration clauses in international disputes? Did she think the opposing counsel was likely to push back on the indemnification language? Questions that could have been answered in an email. Questions that felt less like genuine inquiry and more like excuses to keep her in his office, in his space, under his attention. He didn't realize this moment would come back to haunt him. 2 hours passed. Then 3. At 12:30, Zane's phone buzzed with a message he glanced at and dismissed. "We'll break for lunch," he said. "Order something to be delivered here. My card is in the top drawer. Get whatever you want. I usually eat at my desk." "Not today. It wasn't a request. We still have work to finish, and I prefer not to waste time with you leaving and returning. Order enough for both of us." Piper ordered Thai food because it was the first thing that came to mind, and they ate in his office, while he asked her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with contracts, what she thought about the company's expansion into the European market, whether she'd reviewed the quarterly reports from the subsidiary operations, if she had any concerns about the personnel changes in the accounting department. Normal questions wrapped in abnormal context, professional topics delivered with an undercurrent of something that felt distinctly unprofessional. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. By 2 p.m., Piper's nerves were frayed to breaking. "Mr. Thorne, I really need to prepare for the 3 p.m. meeting." "The meeting's been moved again," Zane said, not looking up from the document he was pretending to read. 5 p.m. now. Conference room. Which gives us more time to finalize these contracts. There's nothing left to finalize. We've reviewed every clause 3 times. Then we'll review them a 4th time. Zane finally looked up, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch something hungry and possessive and barely controlled. "Unless you have somewhere more important to be?" He didn't want revenge, he needed it. "No," Piper said quietly, understanding finally that this wasn't about the contracts at all. This was about control. This was about keeping her close, keeping her attention fixed on him instead of wandering toward Axel or anyone else. This was jealousy wearing the mask of professional necessity. "No, Mr. Thorne. I don't have anywhere more important to be." "Good." Zane's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then let's continue." They worked, or pretended to work, until the city lights began glowing against the darkening sky outside his windows. The 5 p.m. meeting came and went, canceled via email without explanation. At 7 p.m., Zane finally closed the contract file and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to simultaneously run from the room and lean closer. Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. "You can go now," he said quietly. "Thank you for your diligence today." Piper gathered her tablet and portfolio with hands that felt clumsy and uncertain. She was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. "Miss Lowen?" She turned back. "Yes? Tomorrow morning I'll need you here at 7:30 instead of 8. We have a lot of ground to cover on the Morrison acquisition, and I prefer to start early." They both knew the Morrison acquisition didn't require pre-dawn meetings. They both knew this was something else, another excuse, another manufactured reason to keep her close, to monopolize her time, to ensure that whatever attention she might have considered giving to Axel Jett would be impossible to spare. What followed next was completely unexpected. Of course, Piper said. 7:30. I'll be here. I know you will be, Zane said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like satisfaction, like he'd won a battle she hadn't realized they were fighting. As Piper left his office and walked through the now empty executive floor toward the elevator, she understood with sudden, chilling clarity that something fundamental had shifted. The professional boundary she'd relied on for 11 months had been obliterated by 3 careless words, and Zane Thorne had decided that the rules no longer applied. And the most terrifying part was that she wasn't sure whether she was afraid of what he might do next, or afraid of how much she wanted to find out. If people who abuse power and manipulate others just to keep them close make your blood boil like they do mine, hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's stand together against everyone who's ever used control disguised as care. This is just the beginning. The next morning, Piper arrived at 7:25. Her hair still damp from the shower she'd rushed through after waking at 6 a.m. to a text message that had consisted of a single word: "Don't be late." She'd chosen her clothes with more care than usual, a navy sheath dress that was professional but fitted, heels that added 3 inches to her height but still left her significantly shorter than Zane, minimal jewelry, except for the small silver hoops her mother had given her when she graduated law school. She told herself she wasn't dressing for him, that this was just normal professional presentation, but the lie tasted bitter even in her own mind. But what he discovered next changed everything. The executive floor was nearly empty at this hour, most staff not arriving until 8:30 or later. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of elevators moving between floors. Zane's office door was already open, light spilling out into the corridor like an invitation or a trap. She found him at his desk, dressed in another impeccable suit, this one charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe, paired with a black shirt open at the collar and no vest today, slightly more casual but no less intimidating. He looked like he'd been there for hours, which he probably had been, because men like Zane Thorne didn't need sleep the way normal people did. They ran on ambition and caffeine and whatever dark fire burned in the place where other people kept their capacity for rest. "Good morning, Miss Lowen," he said without looking up from his computer screen. "Coffee's fresh. Help yourself." Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected. Piper poured herself a cup from the French press on his sidebar. When had he started making coffee in his office, instead of getting it from the common area, and sat in the chair across from his desk that was starting to feel like her assigned seat in a classroom, where the teacher had very specific, very unpredictable rules. "The Morrison acquisition," Zane said, finally looking at her. His eyes were shadowed like he hadn't slept much, but his focus was laser-sharp, predatory. "I need you to pull all communications between our legal team and theirs from the past 6 months. Every email, every memo, every phone log. I want a complete timeline." "That's going to take hours," Piper said. "Those files are stored across multiple systems. Then it's fortunate I have you starting early." Zane's expression didn't change, but there was something in his voice that suggested he'd known exactly how long the task would take and had assigned it anyway. "I'll need the timeline by noon." She worked at the small conference table in his office, not at her desk outside where she usually sat, but in his space, under his observation. Every time she glanced up, she found him watching her, his eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that made her skin feel too warm, too aware. Sometimes he'd pretend to be focused on his own work, but the pretense was thin, transparent, and they both knew it. And suddenly, he realized he was being played. At 9 a.m., Maya stopped by with a question about a client call, poking her head through the open door with a cheerful greeting that died the moment she saw Piper sitting at Zane's conference table. "Oh," Maya said, her eyes widening slightly. "Sorry, I didn't realize you were working in here." "Miss Chen," Zane said coolly, not looking up from his screen. "If you need Miss Lowen for something, you'll have to wait. She's occupied with a priority project." "Right," Maya said slowly, her gaze shifting between them with obvious confusion. "I'll just come back later." After Maya left, Zane stood and closed his office door, completely. The click of it shutting felt louder than it should have. "I prefer not to be interrupted when we're working on sensitive acquisitions," he said, returning to his desk. They both knew the Morrison acquisition wasn't sensitive. It was a straightforward purchase of a logistics company that had been in negotiation for months with minimal complications. But Piper didn't argue, just kept pulling files and building the timeline he'd requested, hyper-aware of the closed door, the isolation, the way the office felt smaller with just the two of them sealed inside it. Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all. At 10:30, Zane asked her opinion on a clause in the purchase agreement, a clause she'd reviewed yesterday, that they'd discussed yesterday, that had required no additional analysis yesterday. She explained it again, and he listened with the kind of focused attention that felt less like professional interest and more like he was memorizing the sound of her voice, the way her hands moved when she gestured, the exact shade of pink her cheeks turned when she realized he'd been staring at her mouth while she talked. At 11 a.m., he requested she bring him the physical files from the storage room on the 38th floor, files that were also digitized and accessible from his computer, files that had no practical reason to be retrieved in physical form. She went anyway, taking the stairs instead of the elevator because she needed the time to breathe, to think, to figure out what the hell was happening and why she wasn't more afraid of it than she should be. He should have walked away, but then he saw it. When she returned with the files, she found Axel Jett in Zane's office. The Capo was leaning against the sidebar where the coffee lived, holding a mug and talking about something related to a shipment delay in Newark. He looked relaxed, casual, dressed in dark jeans and a gray Henley that clung to his frame in ways that should be illegal. When Piper entered carrying the stack of files, he turned and smiled slow, knowing, deliberately charming. "Morning, Piper," Axel said, using her first name with the easy familiarity of someone who'd decided they were friends whether she'd agreed to it or not. "Working hard or hardly working?" "The former," Piper said, setting the files on Zane's desk without meeting Axel's eyes. "That's because the boss here doesn't believe in reasonable working hours," Axel continued, his tone light but his eyes sharp, watching Zane with the assessment of someone who knew exactly what buttons he was pushing. "Got you doing weekend hours on a Thursday morning?" His right-hand man had been hiding something from him. "Miss Lowen's schedule is none of your concern, Jet," Zane said, his voice dropping 20 degrees. His eyes hadn't left Axel since Piper entered the room, tracking him the way a wolf tracks a rival near its territory. "Just making friendly conversation," Axel said innocently. "Piper, you look exhausted. When's the last time you took a lunch break?" "An actual lunch break, I mean, not eating at your desk while reviewing contracts." "I'm fine," Piper said quickly, sensing the danger in this conversation. The way Zane's jaw had tightened and his hands had gone very still on his desk, always a warning sign that violence or its verbal equivalent was about to erupt. Everyone thought the deal went smoothly, but they were wrong. "You know what?" Axel continued, pushing harder because apparently he'd decided that poking the angry Mafia boss was an entertaining way to spend his morning. "We should grab lunch sometime. There's that new Italian place on Park Avenue supposed to have incredible carbonara. What do you say? Tomorrow, maybe?" The silence that followed was so absolute that Piper could hear the climate control system click on, could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears, could hear what sounded very much like Zane Thorne's careful control beginning to fracture. And then the gun clicked. "Jet," Zane said quietly. Too quietly. The kind of quiet that preceded explosions. "I need you to leave. Now." "Sure, boss." Axel straightened, his smile never wavering. "Just trying to be friendly to your staff. You know, boost morale, team building. All that modern management stuff you're always reading about." He turned to Piper, and his expression softened into something that looked almost genuine. "Offer stands, Piper. Anytime." He left, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt like a match being struck near gasoline. His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. Zane stood slowly, his movements controlled but his eyes burning with barely restrained fury. "Did he ask you out yesterday? After the incident in the coffee area?" "No," Piper said truthfully. "Has he ever asked you out before?" "No, Mr. Thorne. That was the first time. And are you going to accept?" The question came out rough, strained, like it was being dragged through broken glass. Piper met his gaze, seeing the possessive rage churning beneath the surface, the jealousy that had nothing to do with professional boundaries and everything to do with ownership, with territoriality, with the kind of primal claim that civilized people weren't supposed to acknowledge. "Would it matter if I did?" "Yes." The word was immediate, unguarded, stripped of pretense. Yes, it would matter. This single decision gave him the upper hand again. "Why?" Piper asked, even though she knew the answer, could see it in every rigid line of his body, in the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "Why would my lunch plans with a colleague matter to you?" Zane crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough that breathing required conscious effort, because the thought of you sitting across a table from him, laughing at his jokes, letting him pour you wine, letting him look at you the way He stopped abruptly, his jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "The way you what?" Piper whispered. He had no idea the night would end in blood. "The way I have no right to," Zane finished. And for the first time since she'd known him, his voice held something that sounded almost like anguish. "I'm your employer. I sign your paychecks. I control your career trajectory. I have no right to care where you eat lunch or who asks you to dinner or whether you find my Capo handsome." He paused, his eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. "But I do care, Piper. I care so much that it's destroying every professional boundary I've spent my entire career maintaining, and I don't know how to stop." Piper's breath caught in her throat, trapped somewhere between fear and exhilaration, between the knowledge that this was dangerous and the terrible, wonderful realization that she didn't want him to stop. "Mr. Thorne, tell me you won't have lunch with him," Zane said, and it wasn't quite a command, but wasn't quite a request either, existing somewhere in the space between authority and pleading. "Tell me that whatever this is between us, this thing we're not naming, this line we keep pretending we're not crossing, tell me it matters enough that you won't let him take you to dinner and charm you with that easy smile and that calculated charisma he uses on everyone." Under the floorboard, he discovered a truth he wasn't ready for. Piper started. But the words caught in her throat because she didn't know how to finish that sentence. Didn't know if honesty would save them or destroy them or both. The office phone rang, shrill and intrusive, shattering the moment like glass under a hammer. Zane stared at it for 3 rings before finally stepping back and answering with clipped professionalism. "Thorne." Pause. "Fine. Conference room. 5 minutes." He hung up and looked at Piper, his expression smoothing back into that professional mask that was becoming increasingly transparent. "Meeting. I need you there with the Morrison files." They walked to the conference room together, maintaining careful distance, not speaking. But when they passed Maya in the corridor, Piper saw her friend's eyes widen slightly at whatever she saw in their faces, at the tension radiating between them like heat shimmer on asphalt, at the way Zane tracked Piper's movements like a predator who'd identified prey he had no intention of sharing. As they entered the conference room full of executives who needed decisions made and contracts approved, Piper understood with crystalline clarity that this wasn't over. Yesterday had been the detonation. Today was the fallout. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. And tomorrow would be worse. Axel Jett had spent 7 years working for Zane Thorne, which meant he'd developed a finely tuned instinct for reading his boss's moods, the subtle shifts in posture that preceded violence, the particular quality of silence that meant someone was about to lose their position or their life, the almost imperceptible tightening around Zane's eyes that signaled he was 3 seconds from calculated brutality. But this jealous, possessive fury, barely contained beneath a veneer of professionalism, this was new territory, and Axel found it absolutely fascinating. But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. He'd noticed Zane watching Piper for months, though the boss had clearly believed he was being subtle about it. The way Zane's attention would sharpen when she entered a room, the way he'd engineered reasons to keep her working late, the way he'd shut down 3 separate attempts by other executives to poach her for their departments, with the kind of territorial aggression usually reserved for business rivals trying to encroach on his operations. Axel had filed it away as interesting, but not actionable. The boss had a type, apparently, and that type was competent women with sharp minds and soft mouths who didn't realize they were being hunted. What he didn't know was that someone was watching. But yesterday's incident with the coffee and the accidental compliment had changed the equation entirely. Yesterday, Zane's carefully maintained control had cracked, and Axel had seen something raw and desperate underneath something that could be used, manipulated, pushed to see exactly how far the unshakable Zane Thorne would bend before he broke completely. It wasn't malicious, exactly. Axel genuinely liked Piper. She was intelligent, kind in a way that was rare in their world, and she looked at Axel like he was a dangerous animal she was trying very hard not to startle, which he found both amusing and oddly endearing. But more than that, Axel believed his boss deserved something other than the lonely empire he'd built, and if pushing Zane's buttons was what it took to force him into admitting what everyone else could already see, then Axel was happy to be the catalyst. He trusted her, and that was his biggest mistake. So on Friday morning, when Piper emerged from Zane's office looking exhausted and wound-tight with tension, Axel made his move. "Piper," he called out as she headed toward the break room, probably desperate for coffee that wasn't tainted by the claustrophobic intensity of Zane's private office. "Hold up a second." She turned, and he saw the wariness in her eyes, the way she glanced back toward Zane's closed door like she was checking whether the boss could see them talking. "I really need to get back." Just take 30 seconds, Axel said, moving closer with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been afraid of consequences. I wanted to apologize about yesterday, the lunch invitation. I didn't realize I was stepping into something complicated. Piper's cheeks flushed pink. There's nothing complicated. Mr. Thorne is my employer, that's all. Someone in the room was lying, but who? Right, Axel said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. That's why he spent all of yesterday keeping you locked in his office like you were the crown jewels and he was afraid someone might steal you. Very normal boss behavior. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Axel leaned against the wall, studying her with the kind of attention that made most people uncomfortable, cataloging the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at Zane's door like it was magnetic north and she was a compass needle. Look, I'm going to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty in the middle of whatever this situation is. Zane's my boss, and I respect the hell out of him. He's brilliant, ruthless when he needs to be, and he's kept this organization running smoothly for years. But he's also the most emotionally repressed human being I've ever met, and watching him try to handle actual feelings is like watching someone try to defuse a bomb with a hammer. For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. I don't think you should be telling me this, Piper said quietly. Probably not, Axel agreed. But someone needs to, because you're walking around looking terrified and confused, and he's walking around looking like he wants to murder anyone who gets within 3 feet of you. And that's not sustainable, Piper. Something's going to break, and I'd prefer it wasn't you. Before Piper could respond, Maya appeared around the corner, stopping short when she saw them talking. Oh, she said, her eyes widening. Am I interrupting? Not at all, Axel said smoothly. I was just asking Piper if she wanted to grab lunch today. There's a great sandwich place on Lexington, best pastrami in the city. You should both come. Make it a group thing, very casual. Very innocent. But what he didn't know was that someone was watching. I can't, Piper said immediately, too quickly, and Axel saw the panic flash across her face. I have too much work. Everyone has too much work, Axel countered. That's the nature of working for a perfectionist who thinks sleep is optional and lunch breaks are signs of weakness. But you still have to eat, and eating somewhere other than your desk while reviewing contracts is actually good for productivity. There are studies. He's not wrong, Maya offered carefully, clearly sensing the undercurrents but not fully understanding them. You barely ate anything yesterday, Piper. You're going to make yourself sick. In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. Fine, Piper said. And Axel saw the moment she made the decision, saw the flash of something that looked almost like defiance, like she was tired of being controlled and was choosing to push back in the only way available to her. Lunch. But just for an hour, and Maya comes with us. Perfect, Axel said, smiling in a way he knew would look completely innocent to anyone who didn't know better. I'll meet you both in the lobby at noon. He watched Piper walk away, saw the exact moment when Zane's office door opened and the boss stepped out, his eyes immediately finding Piper in the corridor like a homing beacon locked on target. Zane's gaze shifted to Axel, and the expression on his face was pure territorial rage, barely leashed, barely civilized, the kind of look that in their line of work usually preceded bodies being disposed of in creative ways. Axel held his boss's stare for 3 seconds, then smiled and offered a small, mocking salute before turning and walking toward the elevators. Behind him, he heard Zane's office door slam with enough force to rattle the glass walls. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. Perfect. The morning crawled by with agonizing slowness. Axel handled his usual responsibilities, coordinating with their distribution network, reviewing security protocols for an upcoming shipment, dealing with a territorial dispute in Brooklyn that required his particular brand of diplomatic violence. But his attention kept drifting to Zane's office, watching through the glass walls as the boss paced like a caged animal, making phone calls with barely controlled aggression, staring at his computer screen without actually reading anything on it. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. At 11:45, Zane summoned Axel to his office with a text that consisted of 2 words, "Get in here." Axel entered to find Zane standing at his windows, hands clasped behind his back, radiating the kind of cold fury that made lesser men reconsider their life choices. "You asked Piper to lunch?" Zane said without preamble. "I did," Axel confirmed, settling into the chair across from Zane's desk with deliberate casualness, along with Maya Chen. "It's a group thing, very casual, very public, absolutely nothing for you to be concerned about." "I'm not concerned," Zane said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. I'm telling you to cancel it. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. Can't do that, boss. Axel kept his tone light, friendly, completely at odds with the threat hanging in the air between them. Already made the reservation. It would be rude to cancel now. Zane turned, and his eyes were molten with barely restrained violence. Let me be very clear, Jet. Piper Lowen is off limits. Completely. Permanently. If you ask her to lunch again, if you smile at her in the hallway, if you so much as look at her for longer than professionally necessary, I will make your life extremely difficult. Off limits. Axel repeated slowly, like he was tasting the words. Interesting choice of phrasing. Because that implies she's someone's territory. And last I checked, Piper was a grown woman with her own agency, who can decide who she wants to have lunch with. She works for me. His right-hand man had been hiding something from him. She works for the company. You sign her paychecks, sure. But that doesn't give you ownership rights over her personal time or her social interactions. Axel leaned forward, his expression sharpening. Unless there's something else going on here. Something that would explain why you've had her working in your office for the past 2 days. Why you've canceled 3 meetings just to keep her close. Why you look like you want to commit murder every time someone speaks to her. That's none of your business, Zane said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty, and Axel knew he'd hit the target. Maybe not, Axel agreed. But here's what is my business. You're my boss, and I respect you, but you're also my friend, as much as you let anyone be your friend. And I've watched you build this empire while slowly turning into someone who's forgotten how to be human. You don't date, you don't form attachments, you don't let anyone close enough to matter. And then Piper Lowen walks into your life 11 months ago, and suddenly you're different. You smile occasionally, you make jokes, you look like something other than a machine designed to accumulate power and eliminate threats. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. Get to your point, Zane said through gritted teeth. My point is that Piper's good for you, and you're too terrified to do anything about it except hover around her like a possessive ghost and threaten anyone who gets too close. So I'm going to keep pushing until you either admit what you want or let her go completely, because this middle ground where you're making her miserable and making yourself miserable is bullshit, and I'm not going to watch it continue. The silence that followed was absolute and deadly. For 3 seconds, Axel genuinely believed Zane might hit him, saw the muscles in his boss's jaw working, saw his hands curl into fists, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes about whether violence was worth the consequences. His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. Then Zane laughed. A short, bitter sound devoid of humor. You're playing a dangerous game, Jet. I know, Axel said. But someone has to, because left to your own devices, you'll keep circling around what you want without ever reaching for it. And that's a waste, boss. That's a fucking waste of something that could be good if you'd just stop being terrified long enough to try. I'm not terrified, Zane said, but the lie was transparent. Sure you're not. Axel stood, heading toward the door. Lunch is at noon. The place is called Moretti's. If you want to accidentally show up and join us, that would be fine. If you want to keep pretending you don't care where she is or who she's with, that's fine too. But at some point, Zane, you're going to have to make a choice, claim her or let her go. There's no middle ground anymore. This choice would define the rest of his life. He left before Zane could respond, feeling the weight of his boss's stare following him all the way to the elevators. This was going to end in one of 2 ways. Either Zane would finally break down and admit what everyone else could see, or Axel would end up reassigned to their Siberia operation for insubordination. At 11:58, Axel met Piper and Maya in the lobby. Piper looked nervous, her eyes darting toward the elevators like she expected Zane to materialize and forbid her from leaving. Maya looked confused but game, chattering about her morning and a client who demanded revisions to a contract they'd already approved 3 times. What followed next was completely unexpected. They made it halfway to the restaurant 3 blocks from the office, walking through the lunch-hour crowds on Park Avenue before Axel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and smiled. It was Zane, and the message was exactly what Axel had been hoping for. Where are you taking her? The game was on, and Zane Thorne was about to learn that jealousy wasn't something you could control with strategy and intimidation. From here on, the rules of the game changed. It was something that controlled you. The call came at 1:00 p.m. on Sunday night, when Piper was wearing pajama pants and an oversized sweater, her hair in a messy bun, halfway through a documentary about architectural preservation that she wasn't really watching. Her phone lit up with Zane's name, and her stomach immediately knotted with anxiety because he never called her on weekends, never intruded on her personal time, and a call at this hour meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. But this wasn't even the most shocking part. "Miss Lowen?" Zane's voice was clipped, professional, but she could hear the edge of stress underneath. "I apologize for the late call, but we have a situation with the Castellano deal. Their legal team is threatening to walk if we don't renegotiate terms by Tuesday morning, and I need you on a flight to Miami tonight." "Tonight?" Piper sat up, her mind already racing through logistics. "As in right now tonight? I've arranged for a car to pick you up in 90 minutes. Pack for 3 days. We have a secured location where we'll be working with their team to finalize terms. It's going to be intensive, long hours, high pressure. I need your contract analysis skills and your ability to find leverage in complex legal language." "We," Piper repeated carefully. "You're going too?" He knew something that no one else in the building did. "I'm already at the airport." There was a pause, and she heard what sounded like him exhaling slowly. "I know this is unexpected, and I know I'm asking a lot. If you absolutely can't do it, I'll find another way. But I need my best people on this, Piper, and you're the best I have." The use of her first name, the admission that he needed her specifically, the exhaustion in his voice, it all combined to make refusal impossible even if she'd wanted to refuse, which some traitorous part of her didn't. "Okay," she heard herself say. 90 minutes. I'll be ready." She packed in a controlled frenzy 3 days of professional clothes, toiletries, her laptop and tablet, and every charger she owned. The printed files on the Castellano deal she'd been reviewing on Friday before everything had gotten complicated with Axel's lunch invitation, and the way Zane had looked at her afterward like she'd betrayed him by eating his sapertation pastrami sandwich with his capo. Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected. The car arrived exactly 90 minutes later. A black SUV with tinted windows and a driver who took her bag without comment and drove through empty streets toward Teterboro Airport, where private jets lived and people with normal jobs never went. Piper had flown private exactly twice in her life, both times with Zane for urgent business trips, and the luxury of it still felt surreal. Like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Zane was waiting on the tarmac beside a sleek Gulfstream, talking on his phone with the kind of controlled intensity that meant whoever was on the other end was about to agree to something they didn't want to agree to. He was dressed casually for him in dark jeans and a black sweater that clung to his shoulders in ways that absolutely were not appropriate for Piper to notice. When he saw her approaching, he ended the call abruptly and moved to take her bag from the driver. There was one detail everyone missed. "Thank you for doing this," he said, his eyes searching her face like he was checking to make sure she was really there, really solid, really committed to spending the next 72 hours in close quarters working on a deal that probably could have been handled via video conference if he'd wanted it to be. They both knew this wasn't just about the Castellano deal, but neither of them said it out loud. The flight was smooth, quiet, insulated from the world by expensive soundproofing and the particular bubble of unreality that came with traveling at 40,000 feet in a leather-appointed cabin that cost more than most people's houses. Piper tried to work, reviewing files on her laptop while Zane made calls and sent emails from across the cabin, but her attention kept drifting to him, to the way his jaw tightened when he was frustrated, the way his hand moved through his hair when he was thinking, the way he'd glance up and catch her watching, and hold her gaze for 3 seconds too long before they both looked away and pretended the moment hadn't happened. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. They landed at 2 a.m. local time, and Zane drove them himself in a rental car to what he'd called a secured location, which turned out to be a beach house in Key Biscayne. All glass and modern architecture and security systems that probably cost more than the building itself. The Castellano team wouldn't arrive until Monday morning, which meant they had the rest of Sunday night and all of Monday to prepare. "There are 3 bedrooms upstairs," Zane said as they entered the house, his voice carefully neutral. "Take whichever one you want. We'll start work at 7 a.m. Piper chose the room farthest from the master suite, a defensive decision that felt necessary given the way her pulse had been hammering since they'd boarded the plane. She unpacked mechanically, changed into sleep clothes, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the sound of waves crashing against the beach filtered through the windows and made sleep feel impossible. That moment, everything in the room changed. At 3 a.m., she gave up and padded downstairs in search of water and found Zane on the deck, standing at the railing overlooking the ocean, still dressed, clearly not even attempting sleep. He turned when he heard her approach, and in the moonlight his face looked younger, more vulnerable, stripped of the armor he wore in the office. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly. "Too much caffeine," Piper lied, moving to stand beside him at the railing, maintaining careful distance. You? Too much everything. Zane's laugh was soft, bitter. This deal isn't really urgent enough to require a midnight flight to Miami. The Castellano team was posturing, testing to see if we'd panic. We could have handled it via conference call. Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all. Then why did you bring me here? Piper asked, even though she knew. Could feel it in the charged air between them, in the way he was standing so carefully not touching her. Because I needed you away from the office, Zane said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something raw. Away from Axel and his lunch invitations and his calculated attempts to push my buttons. Away from Maya and the other staff and everyone who might have opinions about why I can't seem to let you out of my sight for more than 3 hours. I needed. He stopped, his jaw working like the words were trapped behind teeth he couldn't quite unclench. You needed what? Piper whispered. What she said next shattered his trust instantly. I needed you here, Zane admitted, turning to face her fully. Just you. No professional pretense, no audience, no rules about what's appropriate between an employer and his secretary. Just you and me, and the truth that I've been trying to deny for 11 months. Piper's breath caught in her throat. What truth? That I'm completely, obsessively, dangerously in love with you, Zane said, and his voice cracked on the confession like something breaking after being held together too long by force of will alone. That I think about you constantly, what you're doing, who you're talking to, whether you're safe, whether you're happy. That watching Axel smile at you makes me want to commit violence in ways that should concern me but don't. That every minute you're not in my sight feels like missing a limb I didn't know I needed until it was gone. Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. Mr. Thorne. Zane, he interrupted. When it's just us, when we're not playing the game of professional distance, I need you to call me Zane. Zane, Piper repeated, and his name in her mouth felt dangerous and necessary, and like crossing a line she'd never be able to uncross. This isn't. We can't. I know, Zane said. I know all the reasons this is impossible. I'm your boss. I control your career. The power dynamic is completely fucked. Getting involved with me would compromise your professional reputation and possibly put you in danger from people who'd see you as leverage against me. I've listed all these reasons to myself approximately 6,000 times, and none of them matter because I can't stop wanting you anyway. This choice would define the rest of his life. He took a step closer, and Piper's body responded instinctively, swaying toward him like gravity had shifted, and he'd become the center point. Tell me to stop, Zane said quietly, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from her face, the touch feather-light but sending electricity straight through her nervous system. Tell me this is inappropriate, and you want to maintain professional boundaries, and I'll step back. I'll spend the next 3 days being nothing but your employer, and when we return to New York, I'll stop manufacturing reasons to keep you close. I'll let you have lunch with whoever you want, and I'll ignore the way it makes me feel like something's being carved out of my chest. Just tell me that's what you want. Piper stared up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the desperate hope barely contained beneath the surface, the way his hand trembled slightly as it curved against her cheek, and she realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that she couldn't tell him to stop, that she'd been lying to herself for months about what she felt, about why her pulse raced when he entered a room, about why the thought of Axel's easy charm left her completely cold, while Zane's barely controlled intensity made her feel like she was burning from the inside out. He didn't realize this moment would come back to haunt him. I don't want you to stop, she whispered, and watched something in his expression crack open, relief and hunger and desperate gratitude all flooding through at once. Thank God, Zane breathed, and then his mouth was on hers, and the world reduced to the taste of him, coffee and desperation, and 11 months of restrained wanting finally unleashed. His hands framed her face like she was something precious and breakable, and he kissed her with the kind of focused intensity he brought to everything. Like if he could just get this right, if he could just make her feel what he felt, then maybe the impossible could become possible. What followed next was completely unexpected. Piper's hands fisted in his sweater, pulling him closer, and he made a sound low in his throat that sent heat straight through her. He backed her against the deck railing, his body pressing against hers, and for 3 perfect seconds, nothing else existed, not the deal, not the office, not the professional complications waiting for them back in New York. Just this. His mouth on hers, his hands sliding into her hair, the ocean crashing below them, and the stars overhead, and the feeling of falling that was either the most dangerous thing she'd ever done or the thing she'd been moving toward since the first day she'd walked into Zane Thorne's office and felt the world tilt on its axis. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zane pressed his forehead against hers and laughed a real laugh. warm and surprised and full of wonder. "I've imagined that approximately 1,000 times," he admitted, "and it was better than every single fantasy." "Just 1,000?" Piper asked, and was rewarded with another kiss, softer this time but no less devastating. He had no idea the night would end in blood. "Fine," Zane conceded against her mouth. 10,000. Possibly more. I lost count around month 6. They stood there for a long time, wrapped around each other while the ocean provided soundtrack, and the real world waited somewhere beyond the protected bubble of this house. This moment, this truth that changed everything. Eventually, exhaustion dragged them back inside, up to the master bedroom, a mutual, unspoken decision that separate rooms were no longer necessary or wanted. They fell asleep tangled together on top of the covers, Zane's arm around her waist and her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear. And for the first time in 11 months, Piper felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war, even if it meant burning down every professional boundary that had kept them safe. They worked Monday in the kind of exhausted, euphoric haze that came from 3 hours of sleep and the earth-tilting realization that everything had changed between them. The Castellano team arrived at 9 a.m., 3 lawyers and their CEO, all business and aggressive negotiation tactics, and Zane transformed back into the ruthless executive who'd built an empire on calculated precision. But every time he looked at Piper across the conference table, something in his eyes softened, warmed, betrayed the truth of what they'd become to each other in the dark hours of early morning. But what he discovered next changed everything. They worked until 8 p.m., hammering out contract terms and finding leverage in clauses the Castellano team thought were ironclad. When their opponents finally left, exhausted and outmaneuvered, Zane pulled Piper into his arms and kissed her with the kind of relief that suggested he'd been barely holding himself together all day. "That was torture," he muttered against her mouth. "Sitting 3 feet away from you and pretending to care about acquisition terms when all I wanted was this." "We got them to agree to our terms," Piper pointed out, breathless, "because you found that liability loophole in Section 19 that gave us all the leverage we needed." "You're brilliant." Zane kissed her again, deeper this time. "And you're mine. Say it." In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. "Yours," Piper whispered, and felt him shudder against her. They spent Monday night learning each other the geography of skin and breath, and the particular sounds that meant pleasure, that meant more, that meant don't stop. Zane was careful with her, reverent, like he couldn't quite believe she was real, and his in choosing him despite all the reasons she shouldn't. And Piper discovered that beneath the controlled exterior, Zane Thorne was desperate and attentive and capable of making her forget her own name with his hands and mouth and the focused intensity he brought to everything he wanted. Tuesday, they finalized the Castellano deal with signatures and handshakes and the satisfaction of victory. Tuesday night, they flew back to New York, holding hands beneath the armrest, Zane's thumb tracing circles on her palm like he needed the constant contact to believe this was real. Everyone thought the deal went smoothly, but they were wrong. Wednesday morning, reality crashed back in. Piper arrived at the office at 8 a.m. to find Maya waiting at her desk with wide eyes and a coffee cup clutched between her hands like a shield. "Where were you?" Maya demanded in an urgent whisper. "You disappeared Sunday night, no text, no explanation, and then you weren't here Monday or Tuesday. And Zane wasn't here either. And everyone's been whispering about whether you got fired or whether something happened." "I was in Miami," Piper said, settling into her chair and powering up her computer. "Emergency trip for the Castellano deal. It's fine, Maya. Everything's fine." "Is it?" Maya leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Because Axel's been asking about you. Like, a lot. He came by your desk Monday afternoon looking for you. And when I said you weren't here, he looked, I don't know, concerned. He asked if I knew where you'd gone, and I said I didn't. And then he asked if Zane was in the office. And when I said no, he got this weird expression on his face. He should have walked away, but then he saw it." Piper's stomach sank. What kind of weird expression? Like he'd figured something out. Like pieces had clicked together that he'd been waiting to click. Maya glanced toward Zane's office, which was still dark and empty. "Piper, what's going on?" "Because I'm your friend, and I'm worried, and you look like—" She stopped, her eyes widening. "Oh my God. You look different. Your hair's different, and you're wearing lip gloss you never wear. And you have this glow that people only get when they're—" She gasped. "Piper. Did you sleep with him?" "Maya. But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. You did. You slept with Zane Thorne. Our boss. The terrifying Mafia." She caught herself, lowering her voice even further. The terrifying guy who signs our paychecks and makes grown men cry in contract negotiations. Please tell me I'm wrong. Please tell me you didn't actually. I can't talk about this here, Piper said firmly, her cheeks burning. It's complicated, and it's private, and I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. Do you? Maya asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice rather than judgment. Because Piper, he's not just your boss, he's you know what he is, what he's involved in, what that world is, and getting involved with him means getting pulled into all of that, and I don't want to watch you get hurt. His right-hand man had been hiding something from him. Before Piper could respond, Axel appeared around the corner, coffee cup in hand and that infuriatingly knowing smile on his face. Ladies, he greeted them, his eyes lingering on Piper, with assessment that made her skin prickle. Piper, glad you're back. I was starting to worry the boss had spirited you away to some undisclosed location for nefarious purposes. Just a business trip, Piper said, keeping her voice steady. The Castellano deal required in-person negotiations. Right, the Castellano deal. Axel's smile widened. How convenient that you and Zane both disappeared at the same time for this urgent, unscheduled trip that definitely was about business and nothing else. That moment, everything in the room changed. Jet. Zane's voice cut through the corridor like a blade, and Piper's pulse jumped because she hadn't heard him arrive, hadn't realized he was there listening. He stood near the elevators, dressed in another immaculate suit, his hair still damp from a morning shower, and his eyes were locked on Axel with predatory focus. My office. Now. Sure thing, boss, Axel said easily, but he winked at Piper before following Zane, and her stomach twisted with anxiety about what was about to happen behind that closed door. Maya grabbed her arm the moment they were alone. Piper, whatever's happening between you and Zane, you need to be careful, because Axel knows, and if Axel knows, other people will figure it out soon, and this is going to get complicated fast. I know, Piper whispered, watching Zane's office door close and imagining the conversation happening inside Axel's knowing commentary, Zane's barely controlled fury, the balancing act between boss and friend and rival that was about to get significantly more difficult. Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected. She tried to focus on work, but her attention kept drifting to Zane's office, to the shadows moving behind the frosted glass, to the way her phone stayed silent when usually he'd text her updates throughout the morning. An hour passed, then 2. At 11 a.m., Axel emerged looking amused and entirely too satisfied, heading toward the elevators without glancing her direction. At 11:15, Piper's phone finally buzzed with a text from Zane. Lunch. You and me. Not here. They met at a small Italian restaurant, 6 blocks from the office, tucked into a corner booth where they could see the door but had relative privacy. Zane looked tense, his jaw tight, and he reached for her hand immediately, threading their fingers together on the table like he needed the contact to ground himself. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. Axel knows, he said without preamble. He's known since Sunday, apparently. He tracked the flight manifest and figured out where we went, and he's been enjoying himself immensely with his various insinuations. What did you tell him? Piper asked. The truth. Zane's eyes met hers, dark and serious. That what's between us is none of his business, but that yes, things have changed, and no, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He suggested that I should probably announce it properly before rumors spread, and I told him that's your decision to make, not mine. Announce it, Piper repeated carefully. As in, tell everyone in the office that we're what exactly are we, Zane? He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. Mine, he said immediately, intensely. You're mine, and I'm yours. And I don't particularly care what terminology we use, as long as everyone understands that you're not available, not interested, and absolutely off-limits to anyone who might think about asking you to lunch or coffee or anything else. Piper felt heat curl in her stomach at the possessive certainty in his voice. That's going to make work complicated. Everything about this is complicated, Zane agreed. But I'm done pretending, Piper. I'm done manufacturing excuses to keep you close and controlling my expression when other men look at you and lying to myself about what I feel. If you want to keep this quiet, if you want to maintain professional appearance in the office, I'll respect that. But outside these walls, I'm not hiding you. I'm not pretending you're just my secretary. I'm claiming you, publicly and completely, because the alternative, letting anyone think you might be available, might be interested in someone else, that's not something I'm capable of anymore. This choice would define the rest of his life. Before Piper could respond, Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her eyes widened. "It's Axel." "Don't answer it," Zane said immediately. But Piper's curiosity overrode caution, and she accepted the call. "Hello? Piper, hi." Axel's voice was casual, friendly, completely at odds with the tension radiating from Zane across the table. "Listen, I know you're probably at lunch right now, possibly with the boss, but I wanted to extend an invitation for tomorrow night. There's a networking event for young professionals in tech and finance, very legitimate, very career-focused, and I thought you might want to come. Good opportunity to make connections outside the company, meet people who could be useful down the line. Maya's coming too. What do you say?" He realized he wasn't alone, someone else had arrived. Piper looked at Zane, saw the way his jaw had locked down, the way his hand had tightened around hers almost painfully. "I don't know, Axel. I have a lot of work. It's just a few hours." Axel pressed. 7 to 10 p.m., open bar, good food, interesting people. And like I said, Maya will be there, so it's not like I'm asking you out on a date or anything that would make certain people territorial and jealous. The last part was clearly meant to be heard by Zane, whose expression had gone absolutely murderous. Piper made a split-second decision, partly because she was genuinely interested in networking opportunities, partly because Axel's obvious button-pushing was transparent enough that going would prove she wasn't being controlled, and partly because some reckless part of her wanted to see what would happen if she pushed back against Zane's possessive certainty. And suddenly, he realized he was being played. "Okay," she said. "Text me the details. I'll see you there." She hung up before she could lose her nerve, and found Zane staring at her with an expression that was equal parts fury and disbelief. "You said yes," he said flatly. "It's networking," Piper said. Even though her stomach was twisting with anxiety, "Maya will be there. It's completely innocent." "He knows exactly what he's doing," Zane interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "He's testing me, testing us, seeing how far he can push before I lose control completely. From here on, the rules of the game changed." "Maybe that's exactly why I need to go," Piper said quietly. "Because I'm not your possession, Zane. I'm not something you get to control and monitor and dictate terms to. What we have, what we became in Miami, that was my choice. But it's still my choice going forward. And that means I get to decide whether I attend a professional networking event with colleagues." The silence that followed was absolute and charged. Zane's eyes searched hers, and she saw the battle happening behind them between the man who'd built an empire on control and the man who'd confessed his feelings on a beach deck while the ocean crashed below. Finally, he nodded, a sharp, angry movement. "Fine, go to your networking event. But understand something. Piper, I'm not going to pretend I'm okay with this. I'm not going to smile and wish you a good time while Axel plays his games and pushes boundaries he knows damn well exist. You want independence. You have it, but don't expect me to be civilized about watching you exercise it." His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. He stood, throwing cash on the table to cover the bill they hadn't eaten, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Piper sat frozen, her heart hammering, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake or established a necessary boundary. She'd find out tomorrow night, when Zane either respected her choice or burned down the world trying to stop her. Are you Team Piper standing her ground, or Team Zane's possessive protection? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. The real storm is just beginning. Thursday arrived with the particular tension of a storm. Building on the horizon, you could feel it in the air pressure, in the way the sky darkened at the edges, in the knowledge that something was going to break, and the only question was how much damage it would cause when it did. Piper dressed carefully for the networking event, choosing a burgundy sheath dress that was professional but striking, heels that made her legs look longer, makeup slightly more dramatic than her office standard. She told herself she wasn't dressing for anyone's benefit, but the lie tasted bitter even in her own mind. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. Zane had been coldly professional all day, responding to her emails with clipped efficiency, not calling her into his office even once, maintaining the kind of distance that felt deliberate and punishing. Every time she glanced through his glass walls, she found him working with focused intensity that never quite disguised the rigid tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw stayed locked, the way he'd look up occasionally and catch her watching and hold her gaze with an expression that was part fury and part desperate plea. At 6:30 p.m., as Piper was gathering her things to leave, her phone buzzed with a text from Zane. "Don't go." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, torn between the part of her that wanted to respect his feelings and the part that refused to be controlled by jealous possessiveness disguised as concern. She typed back, "I already committed. Maya's expecting me." One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Then I'm asking. Please, don't go." Piper stared at the word asking, at the acknowledgement that he was requesting rather than commanding, at the vulnerability implicit in that choice. But she'd already decided, already committed to proving that what they had didn't mean surrendering her autonomy, and backing down now would set a precedent she couldn't afford to establish. "I'll be back by 10. We can talk then." No response came. When Piper glanced toward his office, the lights were off, and he was gone left, without saying goodbye, without the ritual of their usual evening departure. The absence felt like cold water on her skin, like a warning she was choosing to ignore. That moment, everything in the room changed. The event was held at a sleek hotel in Midtown. All chrome and glass and perfectly calibrated lighting designed to make everyone look slightly more important than they were. Maya was waiting in the lobby, dressed in a green cocktail dress that highlighted her dark hair, and her expression shifted from excited to concerned the moment she saw Piper's face. "Are you okay?" Maya asked. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad instead of attending a networking mixer." "I'm fine," Piper lied. "Just tired from the Miami trip." "Have you seen Axel yet?" "Not yet, but Piper, are you sure about this? Because I saw Zane leave earlier and he looked absolutely murderous. And if this event is going to cause problems between you two..." "There is no me too," Piper said automatically, the denial reflexive even though it was now completely false. "Zane's my boss, that's all." Someone in the room was lying, but who? Maya gave her a look that suggested she wasn't buying it for a second but was choosing not to push. "Okay. But if at any point tonight you want to leave, just say the word and we'll bail." No questions asked. They entered the ballroom to find it already crowded with young professionals networking with the particular aggressive friendliness that came from open bars and career ambition. Axel found them within 5 minutes, appearing with 3 glasses of champagne, and that easy smile that seemed designed to make everything feel casual and harmless even when it absolutely wasn't. "Ladies," he greeted them, handing over the drinks. "You both look fantastic. Ready to schmooze with tech bros and finance guys who think they're going to be billionaires by 30? That's exactly how I wanted to spend my Thursday evening," Maya said dryly, but she accepted the champagne and followed Axel deeper into the crowd. But what he didn't know was that someone was watching. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of introductions and business cards and conversations about market trends and startup funding and cryptocurrency that Piper only half listened to because her attention kept drifting to her phone, checking for messages from Zane that never came. Axel was attentive without being inappropriate, introducing her to useful contacts, facilitating conversations, maintaining exactly the right distance to seem friendly rather than flirtatious. It was perfectly calibrated, professionally appropriate, and somehow that made it worse because it meant Zane's concerns were unfounded, meant she'd chosen this over him for no reason except stubborn independence. At 8:45 p.m., Piper excused herself to the bathroom, needing a break from the noise and the small talk and the growing guilt sitting heavy in her stomach. She was touching up her lipstick in the mirror when the bathroom door opened and closed with deliberate finality, and she looked up to find Zane standing there, his expression dark with barely controlled fury. He realized he wasn't alone, someone else had arrived. "This is the women's bathroom," Piper said stupidly, her heart suddenly hammering. "I don't care," Zane said, his voice low and dangerous. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, backing her against the marble counter with the kind of controlled aggression that made her pulse race for entirely inappropriate reasons. "You want to tell me what the hell you're doing here?" "Networking," Piper said, lifting her chin. "Just like I told you I would be. You're playing games, Piper. You and Axel both. Testing boundaries like this is some kind of experiment to see how far you can push before I snap." His hands gripped the counter on either side of her, caging her in without touching, and she could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell his cologne mixing with anger and something that smelled like desperation. "Well, congratulations. You've successfully proven that watching you smile at other men while my capo makes small talk and pretends he's not deliberately provoking me is intolerable. Are you satisfied?" For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. "I'm not playing games," Piper shot back, her own anger rising to meet his. "I'm living my life, Zane. I'm attending a professional event with colleagues. The fact that you can't handle me being out of your sight for 3 hours without tracking me down and cornering me in a bathroom, Says more about your control issues than it does about my choices. Control issues, Zane repeated, and something in his expression shifted, something raw and wounded, breaking through the fury. You think this is about control? You think I followed you here because I want to own you like some possession I've acquired? Isn't it? Piper challenged. You've been possessive and jealous since Miami. You can't stand the thought of me talking to Axel or anyone else. You manufacture reasons to keep me close, and you lose your mind when I make plans that don't include you. That's control, Zane. That's trying to own someone. He didn't want revenge, he needed it. You're wrong. Zane's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Rough with emotion, he was finally too exhausted to hide. This isn't about controlling you. This is about terror. This is about waking up Tuesday morning with you in my arms, and realizing for the first time in 23 years that I had something worth protecting, something that could be taken from me, something I could lose, and then watching you get ready to spend an evening with a man who makes you laugh easier than I do, who doesn't carry the weight of violence and empire and all the darkness I've accumulated. That's not about control, Piper. That's about fear. The confession hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Fear of what? Of not being enough, Zane said, and his eyes held hers with desperate honesty. Of you realizing that being with me means accepting all the terrible things I am, and all the dangerous things I do, and all the reasons why loving me is a liability that could get you hurt. Of you choosing someone easier, someone lighter, someone who doesn't come with the weight of an empire built on morally questionable foundations. I'm not trying to control you, Piper. I'm trying to hold on to you before you figure out that you deserve better than what I can offer. Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. Piper felt tears prick her eyes, felt her anger dissolving into something softer and more complicated. You're an idiot, she said, her voice shaking. Zane blinked. What? You're an idiot if you think I don't know exactly who and what you are. If you think I haven't known from the beginning that your business involves things that don't show up on annual reports, that your empire wasn't built purely through legitimate means, that loving you comes with complications and dangers I can't fully understand. She reached up and cupped his face, forcing him to look at her, to see the truth in her expression. I chose you anyway, Zane. In Miami, in that house by the ocean, I chose you knowing all of that. Not because I'm naive or blind, but because when I'm with you, I feel more alive than I've ever felt. Because your intensity and your possessiveness and even your jealousy, they don't scare me. They make me feel wanted in a way I've never experienced. This choice would define the rest of his life. Then why are you here? Zane asked, and his voice cracked slightly on the question. Why did you choose this event over staying with me? Why did you let Axel? Because I needed to prove to both of us that choosing you doesn't mean losing myself, Piper interrupted. That I can love you and still maintain my independence, still make my own decisions, still have autonomy over my life and my choices. Because if I can't do that, if every decision has to be filtered through your approval and your fear, then we're not building a partnership, we're building a cage. Zane was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he exhaled slowly and stepped back, putting distance between them that felt both like respect and loss. You're right, he said quietly. You're absolutely right, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have followed you here. I shouldn't have cornered you in a bathroom like some jealous teenager. I should have trusted that what we have is strong enough to survive you spending an evening at a networking event. He had no idea the night would end in blood. But you don't trust that, Piper said, understanding dawning. You don't trust that I'll choose you when there are easier options available. No, Zane admitted. I don't. Because I've spent my entire adult life believing that attachment was weakness and love was liability. And now I've finally let myself feel both, and I don't know how to do it without terror. I don't know how to love you without trying to protect you from every possible threat, including the threat of you realizing I'm not worth the risk. Piper moved closer, closing the distance he'd created, and pressed her hand against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering beneath expensive fabric. Then we need to establish something right now, before this goes any further. I love you. The words came out before she'd planned them, but once they were spoken, she realized they were true, had been true, probably longer than she'd admitted to herself. I love you, Zane Thorne, with all your control issues and possessive jealousy and terrible fear of loss. But I won't be controlled. I won't surrender my autonomy or my independence or my right to make my own choices just to make you feel secure. If you can't handle that, if you need someone who'll let you dictate terms and monitor their every movement, then we need to end this now before we both get hurt worse than we already are. What she said next shattered his trust instantly. The ultimatum hung in the air between them, sharp and uncompromising. Zane stared at her, and she watched him fight the battle happening behind his eyes between the man who'd built an empire on control and the man who'd finally admitted he was terrified of losing something that mattered more than power ever had. "I can handle it," Zane said finally, his voice rough but certain. "I don't know if I can do it gracefully, and I definitely can't promise I won't have moments where the jealousy makes me want to lock you in a tower and eliminate everyone who looks at you. But I can try, Piper. I can work on trusting that you chose me and you'll keep choosing me even when there are easier options. Because the alternative, losing you because I couldn't let go of control, that's worse than any fear of you leaving. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war." Piper felt relief flood through her, mixed with love and exasperation, and the knowledge that this wasn't solved, that they'd have this battle in different forms for as long as they were together. "I need you to leave," she said gently. "I need you to go back to the office or home or wherever, and let me finish this event on my own terms. Not because I want to be away from you, but because I need to prove to both of us that I can." "And after?" Zane asked. "When the event ends? Come to my apartment," Piper said. "I'll text you when I'm leaving here. And then we'll really talk about what this relationship looks like going forward. About boundaries and trust, and how we navigate the impossible situation we've created." Zane nodded slowly, then leaned down and kissed her soft, tender, full of apology and promise, and the desperate hope of someone who'd finally found something worth more than his empire. "I love you," he said against her mouth. "I should have said it in Miami. I should have said it every day since, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Piper Lowen, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be someone who deserves that you love me back." From here on, the rules of the game changed. He left then, walking out of the bathroom with the controlled grace she'd come to associate with him, leaving her alone with her racing heart and the knowledge that everything had just changed again. She fixed her makeup, smoothed her dress, and returned to the event where Maya and Axel were waiting with identical expressions of concern. "Everything okay?" Maya asked carefully. "Everything's fine," Piper said, and meant it. "But I think I'm ready to leave now. I have somewhere more important to be." Axel studied her with those sharp green eyes, and she saw understanding flicker across his face. "He was here, wasn't he? The boss." "He was," Piper confirmed. "And we talked, and now I'm leaving. Thank you for the invitation, Axel. It was genuinely helpful for networking. But I think you knew this event wasn't really about professional development. But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened." "Guilty," Axel admitted with a rueful smile. "I was testing boundaries, pushing buttons, trying to force the boss to either claim you publicly or let you go completely. Seems like he made his choice." "We both made choices," Piper corrected. "And now we're going to figure out how to make them work." She left the event at 9:15 p.m., texted Zane her address with a simple message, come over, and went home to wait for the man who'd finally admitted he was terrified of losing her. It was time to figure out what loving each other actually looked like when control wasn't an option, and trust was the only currency that mattered. Zane arrived at Piper's apartment at 9:47 p.m., standing in her doorway looking uncharacteristically uncertain, his tie loosened, his hair slightly messed from running his hands through it repeatedly, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something that looked dangerously close to fear. Piper had changed into comfortable clothes, leggings, and an oversized sweater, and her hair was down, makeup washed off, all the professional armor stripped away, leaving just the truth of who they were, without the office and the rules and the carefully maintained distance. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside to let him enter the small one-bedroom apartment that was all she could afford in Manhattan on a secretary's salary, even one as well paid as hers. It was modest compared to what Zane was used to: no floor-to-ceiling windows or designer furniture, just IKEA bookshelves and a couch she'd bought secondhand and artwork from street vendors in Soho. But it was hers, and the vulnerability of letting him into this space felt more intimate than Miami had been. Zane stood in her living room looking lost, his hands shoved in his pockets, and Piper realized with sudden clarity that he had no idea how to do this, how to be with someone in a normal, domestic setting without the structure of work or the adrenaline of crisis to guide the interaction. He'd spent so long building walls that now, standing in her apartment with all defenses stripped away, he didn't know what shape to take. For the first time, he wasn't in control. "Sit," Piper said, gesturing to the couch. "I'll make tea. Or do you want something stronger?" "Tea's fine," Zane said, settling onto her couch with careful precision, like he was afraid of taking up too much space in her world. She made chamomile because it was calming, and they both needed calming. And when she returned with 2 mugs, She found him studying the framed photographs on her bookshelf, her college graduation, her mother's birthday last year, Maya and her at some work event laughing at something now forgotten, evidence of a life he'd existed adjacent to, but never fully entered until now. There was one detail everyone missed. "Your mother," Zane said, pointing to one photograph. "You have her smile." "She lives in Boston," Piper said, settling beside him on the couch with careful distance between them. "She's a teacher. 3rd grade. She doesn't know what you really do. By the way, I told her you run import-export businesses, which is technically true even if it's catastrophically incomplete." "Does she know about us?" Zane asked. "She knows I'm seeing someone. She doesn't know it's my boss or that the situation is complicated enough to require its own legal disclaimer." Piper took a sip of tea, using the warmth to ground herself. "We need to talk about what happens next, Zane. Because we can't keep doing this, the jealousy and the possessiveness and the manufacturing crises to keep me close. It's not sustainable, and it's not healthy for either of us. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart." "I know," Zane said quietly. He set down his untouched tea and turned to face her fully. "I spent the last 2 hours driving around the city trying to figure out how to articulate what I need to say, and I keep coming back to the same impossible truth. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to love someone without trying to control every variable, without eliminating every possible threat, without building walls to protect what matters to me. It's not an excuse. It's just the reality of who I've become." "Then we need to establish rules," Piper said. "Clear boundaries about what's acceptable and what isn't. Because Zane, I meant what I said in that bathroom. I won't be controlled. I won't give up my autonomy or my independence just to make you feel secure. But I also don't want to lose you, which means we need to find middle ground." His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. "What does middle ground look like?" Zane asked. And there was something almost desperate in the question, like he genuinely didn't know. Piper thought carefully, trying to articulate needs she'd never had to define before. "It means you trust me to make my own choices about my social life, my friendships, my career development. It means you don't follow me to events or corner me in bathrooms or manufacture work emergencies to keep me close. It means you communicate your fears instead of acting on them, and you respect my boundaries even when it's uncomfortable." "And what do you give me in return?" Zane asked. "What boundaries do you respect for my peace of mind?" This choice would define the rest of his life. "Honesty," Piper said immediately. "Complete transparency about where I am, who I'm with, what I'm doing. You don't get to control my choices, but you do get to know what those choices are so you're not left imagining worst-case scenarios. And I promise that when men like Axel push boundaries or make invitations that feel more personal than professional, I'll be clear about where I stand, that I'm not available, not interested, completely committed to you." "What about work?" Zane asked. "What about the fact that I'm your boss, and that creates inherent power imbalances we can't simply wish away?" But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. "That's more complicated," Piper admitted. "We could keep it quiet, maintain professional appearance in the office. Or we could be transparent about it, tell HR, establish clear boundaries about how our relationship doesn't impact professional decisions." "I don't know what the right answer is, Zane. I just know that sneaking around and pretending feels dishonest in a way that makes me uncomfortable." Zane was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed. "I want to claim you," he said finally, his voice rough with intensity. "Publicly, completely, in a way that leaves no room for doubt or speculation. I want everyone in that office to know that you're mine, that you chose me, that anyone who thinks about approaching you needs to understand there will be consequences. But I also know that claiming you publicly means exposing you to scrutiny and judgment and potential professional damage. It means people will question whether you earned your position or whether you're sleeping your way to advancement. It means you become a target for anyone who wants to get to me." He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. "Those are risks I'm aware of," Piper said quietly. "And they're risks I'm willing to accept if it means being with you openly instead of hiding what we are. But Zane, claiming me can't mean owning me. It can't mean controlling my every interaction or monitoring my movements or treating me like property you've acquired. It has to mean partnership, 2 people choosing each other, supporting each other, trusting each other even when it's terrifying." "I don't know if I can do that," Zane admitted, and the honesty of it made her chest ache. "I don't know if I'm capable of trust without control. Every instinct I have is screaming at me to eliminate threats, to build walls around you, to keep you so close that nothing can touch you or take you from me. Asking me to trust feels like asking me to disarm in the middle of a war zone." He didn't want revenge, he needed it. Then maybe you need to ask yourself if you're ready for this relationship, Piper said gently, even though the words hurt coming out. Because I can't be with someone who sees loving me as a battle to be won or a territory to be defended. I need a partner, Zane. Not a possessive guardian who thinks protection and control are the same thing. The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. Piper watched Zane struggle with the ultimatum she'd laid out, saw the battle happening behind his eyes between the man he'd been for decades and the man he wanted to become. His hands curled into fists on his thighs, his jaw locked down tight, and she could see him running calculations about risk and reward and whether love was worth the surrender of control it required. Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. "I'm terrified," Zane said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm terrified that if I let go of control, if I trust you to make your own choices and live your own life, something will happen. Someone will hurt you, or take you from me, or you'll realize that the version of me that doesn't try to control everything is weak and not worth staying for. I've built my entire identity on strength and power, and the ability to eliminate threats before they materialize. Loving you means accepting vulnerability I haven't allowed myself to feel since I was 9 years old watching my mother die, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to do that." Piper felt tears burn her eyes at the raw honesty, at the vulnerability he was finally admitting. "You're the strongest person I know," she said, moving closer and taking his clenched fists in her hands, coaxing them open so she could thread their fingers together. "Building an empire takes strength. Maintaining control in chaos takes strength. But you know what takes more strength than either of those things? Choosing to be vulnerable anyway. Choosing to love someone even when it terrifies you. Choosing trust over control even when every instinct screams that trust is dangerous." What followed next was completely unexpected. "And if I fail?" Zane asked, his eyes meeting hers with desperate intensity. "If I try to trust you and I slip back into possessive behavior? If my jealousy gets the better of me and I do something controlling or manipulative? Then we talk about it," Piper said firmly. "Then I call you on it, and you apologize, and we figure out how to do better next time. This isn't going to be perfect, Zane. You're going to make mistakes, and I'm going to make mistakes, and we're going to have fights about boundaries and trust and all the ways we trigger each other's fears. But that's what relationships are: messy, complicated, requiring constant communication and adjustment. The question isn't whether you'll be perfect. The question is whether you're willing to try." Zane pulled her closer, until she was practically in his lap, his arms wrapped around her waist and his face buried in her hair. "I'll try," he said, his voice muffled but certain. "I'll try to trust you, to respect your autonomy, to communicate my fears instead of acting on them. I'll probably fail sometimes. I'll probably have moments where the jealousy makes me want to lock you away from everyone who might look at you wrong. But I'll try, Piper. Because losing you is worse than the terror of letting go of control." In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. "That's all I'm asking," Piper whispered, her arms coming up to hold him back. "Just try. Just keep choosing me and choosing trust even when it's hard." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other on her secondhand couch, breathing in sync and holding on like they were each other's anchor in a storm that hadn't fully passed. Eventually, Zane pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes still shadowed but holding something that looked almost like peace. "I have a request," he said carefully. "Not a demand, not a condition, just something I'm asking for that you're free to say no to." "What is it?" Piper asked. Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all. "Move in with me." The words came out in a rush, like he was afraid if he didn't say them quickly he'd lose his nerve. "Not because I want to control your living situation or monitor your movements, but because I want to wake up with you every morning and come home to you every night. I want to build a life with you that isn't compartmentalized into work hours and stolen moments. I want you in my space, making it ours, filling it with your books and your terrible taste in reality television and all the ordinary domestic things I've never let myself want before." Piper's breath caught in her throat at the vulnerability of the request, at the way he was offering her access to his private sanctuary, the place where he lived when he wasn't being the ruthless executive who commanded empires. "That's fast," she said carefully. "We've only been really together for less than a week. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war." "I know," Zane said. "And if you want to wait, if you want to take this slower, I'll respect that. But Piper, I've wasted 11 months pretending I didn't want you because I was afraid of what wanting you meant. I don't want to waste any more time being cautious when I could be building something real with you. So I'm asking, not demanding, not pressuring, just asking, will you move in with me? Will you let me wake up next to you and argue about whose turn it is to make coffee and fight over thermostat settings and do all the boring, ordinary things that make a life together? Piper thought about her small apartment with its secondhand furniture and modest rent, thought about the practical concerns and the speed of what he was suggesting, and all the reasonable objections she should probably raise. And then she thought about waking up in Miami with his arm around her waist, about the way his penthouse would feel less like a sterile showcase and more like home with her presence in it, about the fact that she loved him enough to take the risk, even when logic suggested caution. He had no idea the night would end in blood. "Yes," she said, watching his expression transform from nervous hope to pure relief. "Yes, I'll move in with you, but we're establishing ground rules about personal space and independence, and if you start treating our shared home like a gilded cage, I'm moving right back out." "Deal," Zane said, and kissed her with the kind of desperate gratitude that suggested he'd been holding his breath waiting for her answer. "You won't regret this. I promise I'll make it worth the risk." "You better," Piper said against his mouth. "Because Zane Thorne, you're asking me to bet my entire life on the gamble that you can learn to love without controlling. That's a huge ask. This choice would define the rest of his life." "I know," Zane said seriously. "And I'm going to spend every day proving I'm worth that bet. Starting with this tomorrow, we tell HR about our relationship. We make it official. Establish protocols to ensure there's no perception of favoritism or impropriety. We do this right, Piper. Transparently. No more hiding, no more pretending, no more existing in the gray area between professional and personal." "Tomorrow," Piper agreed, feeling both terrified and exhilarated. "We claim each other, publicly, completely. No professional rules left to break," Zane murmured, echoing words she hadn't said but that perfectly captured what they were about to do. They spent the rest of the night on her couch, talking about logistics and boundaries and the thousand small details that came with merging lives. And somewhere around 2 a.m., as Piper drifted toward sleep with Zane's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she thought about how they'd gotten here from a carelessly spoken compliment about his capo to this moment of choosing each other despite every reasonable objection. From here on, the rules of the game changed. It was reckless and possibly stupid and definitely complicated, but it was also real. And real, Piper was discovering, was worth every risk. Friday morning arrived with the particular clarity that came from major decisions already made and irreversible actions about to be taken. Piper woke in her own bed. Zane had insisted on leaving around 3 a.m. so she could actually sleep without distraction to a text message that made her pulse jump. "Good morning. I love you. Today we burn down the pretense and build something real. Meet me in my office at 8 a.m. We're doing this together." That moment, everything in the room changed. She dressed with extra care, choosing a charcoal gray dress that was professional but unmistakably feminine, heels that added confidence, minimal jewelry except for the small silver bracelet Zane had given her last night, a spontaneous purchase from an all-night jewelry store he'd stopped at on his way home because, as he'd explained with uncharacteristic shyness, he wanted her to have something that marked her as his even before they made it official. The office felt different when she arrived at 7:45 a.m., or perhaps she felt different, walking through the familiar corridors with the knowledge that everything was about to change. Maya was already at her desk, and her eyes widened when she saw Piper heading not to her own workspace but directly toward Zane's office. "Piper," Maya called out urgently. "What's happening? You look like you're walking into battle. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart." "Something like that," Piper said, managing a smile. "I'll explain later. Just trust me, okay? Whatever happens today, trust that I know what I'm doing." Zane was waiting in his office, standing at his windows with his back to the door, but he turned the moment she entered, and the expression on his face made her breath catch relief and desire, and desperate hope, all mixing together into something so vulnerable it hurt to witness. "You came," he said unnecessarily. "Of course I came," Piper replied, closing the door behind her. "We're doing this together, remember?" He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. Zane crossed to her in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with the kind of intensity that suggested he'd been holding himself together by sheer will, and her presence was the only thing that could make him solid again. "I barely slept," he admitted against her mouth. "I kept thinking you'd change your mind, that you'd wake up and realize this was too complicated and I was too damaged and you deserved someone easier." "I don't want easier," Piper said firmly. "I want you. All of you, the control issues, the possessive jealousy, the terrible fear of vulnerability, all of it. Because underneath all that protective armor, you're someone worth the effort, someone worth the risk. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be someone who deserves that faith, Zane said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other in the growing morning light, building courage for what came next. Finally, Zane pulled back and took her hand, threading their fingers together with deliberate certainty. In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. HR first, he said. We tell Andrea Moss together. Establish clear protocols about how our relationship doesn't impact professional decisions. She'll probably require documentation. Maybe recommend I recuse myself from your performance reviews or salary negotiations. Whatever she asks, we comply completely. We do this right, Piper. Impeccably. Andrea Moss was the head of human resources, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd worked for Zane for 8 years and had a reputation for fairness combined with absolute intolerance for policy violations. She looked surprised when they appeared at her door together at 8:30 a.m., their hands entwined, and Piper saw the moment comprehension dawned in her expression. He knew something that no one else in the building did. Mr. Thorne, Andrea said carefully. Miss Lowen, to what do I owe this joint visit? We need to report a relationship between an executive and his direct report, Zane said without preamble. Piper and I are involved romantically, and we're here to establish appropriate protocols to ensure there's no perception of impropriety or favoritism going forward. Andrea studied them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gestured to the chairs across from her desk. Sit, let's discuss this properly. The next 40 minutes involved paperwork and protocols, and Andrea's carefully worded explanation of company policy regarding workplace relationships. The firm didn't forbid such relationships, but they required disclosure and establishment of clear boundaries. Zane would need to recuse himself from decisions about Piper's compensation, promotions, or performance reviews. A third-party supervisor would need to be assigned to oversee Piper's work and provide objective evaluation. Any perception that their relationship was impacting professional decisions would be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. But what he discovered next changed everything. I need to be clear about something, Andrea said, her eyes sharp as she looked between them. Miss Lowen, I need verbal confirmation that this relationship is consensual, that you don't feel pressured or coerced in any way, and that you understand you have the right to report any concerns about power dynamics or inappropriate behavior without fear of retaliation. I understand, Piper said firmly, and I confirm that this relationship is completely consensual. I'm choosing him with full awareness of the complications it creates. Andrea nodded, making notes. And Mr. Thorne, I need your commitment that you'll respect the boundaries we're establishing, that you won't use your position to influence decisions about Miss Lowen's career, either positively or negatively. Can you make that commitment? I can, Zane said. And I will. Piper's career trajectory should be based solely on her merit and her performance, not on our personal relationship. I'll recuse myself from any decision where there might be perceived conflict of interest. What followed next was completely unexpected. Good, Andrea said, signing the documentation with practiced efficiency. Then I'll have this filed within the hour, and I'll email you both about third-party supervision arrangements by end of day. In the meantime, and this is off the record, I hope you both know what you're doing. Workplace relationships are complicated under the best circumstances. When they involve power differentials like yours, they're exponentially more so. We know, Piper said quietly. But we're willing to navigate the complications. They left Andrea's office hand in hand, and Piper felt the weight of eyes following them as they walked through the corridor. Maya staring with wide-eyed shock, other staff members doing double takes, conversations stopping mid-sentence as people processed what they were seeing. Zane's fingers tightened around hers, but he didn't let go, didn't hide, didn't retreat into the professional distance that had defined them for 11 months. Everyone thought the deal went smoothly, but they were wrong. When they reached his office, he pulled her inside and closed the door, backing her against it with the kind of focused intensity she was learning to associate with moments when his control was slipping and he needed to anchor himself through touch. Everyone knows now, he said, his forehead pressed against hers. By noon, the entire building will have heard. By Monday, it'll be the primary subject of office gossip. Are you ready for that? Are you? Piper countered. Because you're the one who built an empire on control and privacy. I'm just the secretary who fell in love with her terrifying boss. You're not just anything, Zane said fiercely. You're the woman who saw through every defense I built and decided I was worth the effort anyway. You're the person who makes me want to be better than I am. He stopped. struggling with vocabulary that clearly didn't come easily. "You're everything, Piper. Everything I didn't know I needed until you walked into my life and made me realize what I'd been missing. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war." Before Piper could respond, a knock on the door interrupted them. Zane's jaw tightened with annoyance, but he stepped back and called, "Enter." Axel Jett walked in, and his expression cycled through surprise, understanding, and what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "Well," he said, his eyes moving between them with obvious assessment. "I see we're done with the pretense of professional distance. About damn time." "Jet," Zane said warningly. "Don't jet me, boss. I've been watching you two circle each other for months like magnets trying to resist their own nature. I'm actually relieved you finally admitted what everyone else could already see." Axel turned to Piper, and his expression softened into something genuine. "For what it's worth, I'm happy for you both. He needs someone who won't let him retreat into isolation, and you need someone who'll move heaven and earth to keep you safe. Just," he paused, choosing words carefully, "just understand that being with him means accepting all the darkness that comes with his world. And there's a lot of darkness, Piper. More than you probably realize. Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all." "I know," Piper said quietly. "Or at least, I know enough to make an informed choice. The rest I'll figure out as we go." Axel nodded, then looked at Zane with an expression that was part respect, part warning. "You heard her, and best friends or not, we're going to have a problem. Clear?" "Crystal," Zane said, but there was no anger in his voice, just acknowledgement of the legitimate threat and what it represented. "And Axel, thank you. For pushing when I needed pushing, for making me face what I was too afraid to admit. I know the lunch invitations and the button pushing were calculated, and I know they came from a place of wanting me to be happy rather than wanting to cause chaos. So thank you. That's the most emotional speech I've heard from you in 7 years," Axel said with a grin. "Love looks good on you, boss. You should try it more often." From here on, the rules of the game changed. He left, and Piper found herself laughing despite the tension still thrumming through her body. He's going to be insufferable about this, isn't he? He's going to spend months saying, "I told you so," and reminding you that he orchestrated our getting together. "Undoubtedly," Zane agreed. "But he's earned it. And more importantly," he pulled her closer, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that still felt new and precious. "He's right. Love does look good on me. You look good on me. And I'm done pretending otherwise." He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise, and Piper felt the last of her reservations dissolve into certainty. This was reckless and complicated and potentially disastrous for both their careers. But it was also real and honest and worth every risk they were taking. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. When they finally broke apart, Zane's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You belong here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "With me. Not as my employee or my secretary or someone I'm keeping at professional distance. As my partner, my equal. The person I choose every single day, even when it's terrifying. You belong here, Piper. Say you understand that." "I understand," Piper whispered, her hands fisting in his shirt to pull him closer. "I belong with you. And you belong with me. No more professional rules to hide behind. No more pretending. Just this us, building something real. No professional rules left to break," Zane agreed, and kissed her again with the kind of possessive intensity that suggested he was claiming her, branding her as his in a way that went deeper than words or jewelry or public disclosure. This choice would define the rest of his life. They stood there in his office, wrapped around each other as the city woke below them, and their colleagues processed the news spreading through the building. And Piper thought about the journey that had brought them here, from an accidental compliment about a handsome capo to this moment of absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. It was messy and complicated, and probably inadvisable, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. The rest of Friday passed in a blur of whispered conversations and curious stares that Piper felt like physical touches every time she walked through the corridors. Maya cornered her at lunch, demanding every detail with the fervor of someone who'd been watching a slow-burn romance novel unfold in real time and finally reached the payoff chapter. Piper told her everything. Well, almost everything, keeping the more intimate details private, but confirming what Maya had already guessed, that she and Zane were together, that they'd made it official with HR, that she was moving in with him, that yes, this was real and serious and terrifying in the best possible way. But this wasn't even the most shocking part. "I knew it," Maya said triumphantly, though her eyes held concern beneath the excitement. "I've known since Miami. Maybe even before Miami. The way he looked at you, Piper, like you were the only person in the room who mattered. Like he was drowning and you were air. But are you sure about this? I mean, really sure? Because Zane Thorne isn't just your boss. She lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. He's dangerous. Not just in the corporate raider sense, but in the actual danger sense. Being with him means accepting that world. And I need to know you've thought about what that means." "I have," Piper said honestly. "And I'm terrified, Maya. I'm terrified of what loving him might cost, what risks I'm accepting by choosing him, what darkness I might have to witness or accept or live with. But I'm more terrified of the alternative of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what we could have been. So yes, I'm sure, as sure as I can be about something this complicated. Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected." Maya studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay. But Piper, promise me something. Promise that if it ever gets too dangerous, if you ever feel unsafe or trapped or like you've lost yourself in his world, you'll call me. You'll let me help you. Because you're my best friend, and I need to know you have an exit strategy if you need one." "I promise," Piper said, squeezing Maya's hand. "But Maya, I don't think I'll need one. Zane might be dangerous to his enemies. But with me? He's just a man who spent his entire adult life building walls and finally found someone worth tearing them down for. That's not something I need an exit strategy from. That's something worth fighting to keep." The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Zane had meetings with potential investors, conference calls that ran long, a crisis with a shipment in Newark that required Axel's immediate attention and Zane's strategic oversight. Piper worked at her desk or tried to work, her attention fracturing every time someone walked past with a curious glance, or whispered comment just loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. He realized he wasn't alone, someone else had arrived. At 4:30 p.m., an email arrived from Andrea Moss outlining the supervisory changes. Piper would now report directly to James Chen, the CFO, for performance reviews and salary negotiations. Zane had been copied on the email, and 30 seconds after it arrived, her desk phone rang. "My office," Zane said without preamble. "I want to discuss the supervision arrangements." Piper smiled despite herself at the transparent excuse. "Right now?" "Right now, Miss Lowen." And there was something in his voice, amusement mixed with heat, that suggested the discussion would involve significantly less talking than other activities. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. She found him standing at his windows again, but this time when she entered, he turned immediately and crossed to her with purpose, backing her against the closed door and kissing her with the kind of desperate intensity that suggested he'd been holding himself together through sheer willpower and was done pretending he had any control left. "I've been thinking about you all day," Zane muttered against her mouth, his hands sliding into her hair and tilting her head for better access. "Sitting in those meetings pretending to care about investor portfolios when all I could think about was you at your desk. Everyone knowing you're mine now. The whole building understanding that you chose me. That's very unprofessional," Piper managed breathlessly. "We established that there are no professional rules left to break," Zane countered, his mouth moving to her neck in ways that made coherent thought difficult. "We filed the paperwork. We made it official. Which means when we're alone in my office, I don't have to pretend anymore that you're just my secretary and I'm just your boss. I can touch you like this." His hand slid down her sides possessively. "And kiss you like this," he demonstrated thoroughly, "and tell you exactly what I want to do to you the moment we get home tonight." That moment, everything in the room changed. "Zane," Piper said, but it came out more like a plea than a protest. "Someone could—" "No one's going to interrupt," Zane said with certainty. "I've made it very clear that when my door is closed and you're in here, we're not to be disturbed unless the building's on fire. Possibly not even then." They stayed like that for 20 minutes that probably should have been spent working but were infinitely better spent relearning the geography of each other, trading kisses that ranged from gentle to desperate, murmuring promises and plans about the life they were building together. Eventually, reluctantly, they separated enough for Piper to fix her appearance, and Zane to pretend he'd been discussing supervision arrangements, rather than thoroughly compromising his professional boundaries. He had no idea the night would end in blood. At 6 p.m., Zane appeared at her desk, not summoning her via phone or email, but physically walking out to where she worked in full view of anyone still in the office. He was holding his coat and hers, and his expression was soft in a way she'd never seen it in this setting, vulnerable and open and entirely unconcerned with who might be watching. "Ready to go home?" he asked, and the casual domesticity of the question made her chest feel tight with something that was either panic or joy or both. Home, Piper repeated, testing the word. Your penthouse home or my apartment home? Our home, Zane corrected firmly. Starting tonight, if you're willing. I sent a moving crew to your apartment this afternoon. They're packing your essentials, the things you'll need immediately. The rest we can move over the weekend. I hope that's not overstepping, but I couldn't wait any longer to have you in my space, making it ours. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. Piper felt tears prick her eyes at the gesture, at the presumption that should have felt controlling but instead felt like eager anticipation, like he couldn't wait one more day to start building a life with her. You sent a moving crew without asking me? I sent a moving crew and then I'm asking you to forgive me for being presumptuous, Zane amended. If you're not ready, if this is too fast, we can slow down. But Piper, I don't want to spend another night in that penthouse without you. I don't want to wake up tomorrow morning and have to wait hours to see you. I want you there, in my home, our home, filling it with your presence and making it feel like something other than the sterile showcase it's been for years. Okay, Piper said, making the decision in the moment because logic and caution had gotten her nowhere, and sometimes the right choice was the reckless one. Okay, let's go home. Let's really start this, tonight. From here on, the rules of the game changed. Zane's smile transformed his face into something boyish and relieved, and almost heartbreakingly vulnerable. He helped her into her coat with the kind of attentive care that made her feel precious, and then he took her hand publicly, deliberately, in full view of the late working staff who definitely noticed and would definitely talk about it. They walked to the elevators together, rode down 40 floors with their fingers intertwined, and stepped out into the October evening that was cool but not yet cold, perfect for walking. My car's in the garage, Zane said. But if you want, we could walk for a while. It's only about 15 blocks to the penthouse, and the evening's nice. Let's walk, Piper agreed, surprising herself. She'd never walked through the city with Zane before, had never done anything normal and domestic and completely ordinary. Every interaction had been filtered through work or crisis or the weight of everything they weren't saying. This felt different, simple, easy, like they were just two people in love navigating the sidewalks of Manhattan without the complexity of power dynamics and professional ethics weighing them down. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. They walked slowly, hands clasped, talking about nothing important. The restaurant they passed that Zane promised had incredible pasta. The bookstore Piper loved that he'd never been inside. The dog walker with 7 leashes tangled around her legs that made them both laugh. Normal conversation, normal touches, the normal rhythm of people learning each other outside the pressure cooker of their previous context. I need to tell you something, Zane said, as they turned onto his street, his voice shifting to something more serious. About what Axel meant earlier, about accepting the darkness that comes with my world. You deserve to know exactly what you're signing up for. Piper's stomach tightened with anxiety, but she kept her voice steady. Okay, tell me. But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. My businesses are legitimate on the surface, Zane began carefully. The import-export operations, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolios, all of that is legal, properly documented, defensible under scrutiny. But there are aspects of the organization that exist in grayer areas. Money laundering through the legitimate businesses. Territorial agreements with other organizations that involve implicit threats and occasionally explicit violence. Protection rackets dressed up as security consulting. I don't deal drugs. I don't traffic people. I don't target civilians. I have lines I won't cross. But I'm not a good man, Piper. I've done things that would horrify you if you knew the specifics. I've ordered actions that resulted in people being hurt or killed when they threatened what's mine. And being with me means accepting that reality. They'd reached his building, a luxury high-rise with doormen and marble lobbies and the kind of security that made casual visitors impossible. But Zane stopped before entering, turning to face her fully in the streetlight, his expression raw with vulnerability and fear that she'd finally understand what he was and walk away. His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. I appreciate your honesty, Piper said carefully. And I'm not naive enough to pretend I thought your empire was built purely through legal means. But Zane, I need you to understand something too. I'm not asking you to be a good man by conventional moral standards. I'm not asking you to suddenly develop ethical qualms about activities you've been engaged in for years. What I'm asking is that you don't lie to me about it, that you're honest about the realities of your world, that you don't try to shield me from truths you think will scare me away. Can you do that? Can you trust me enough to be completely honest, even when the truth isn't pretty? Yes, Zane said immediately. Yes, I can do that. But Piper, there may come a time when that honesty means telling you things that change how you see me. Things that make you realize I'm not the man you thought I was. What she said next shattered his trust instantly. Then I'll deal with that when it happens, Piper said firmly. But Zane, you need to trust that I'm stronger than you think I am, that I can handle difficult truths, that loving you doesn't mean I'm blind to your flaws or your moral compromises. It means I'm choosing you anyway, with full awareness of who and what you are. So stop waiting for me to run. Stop expecting me to be horrified when I discover some new piece of darkness. I'm not going anywhere. Zane pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. I don't deserve you, he muttered. I don't deserve your faith or your love or your willingness to accept all the terrible things I am, but I'm selfish enough to keep you anyway. Good, Piper said against his chest. Because I'm selfish enough to want to be kept. This choice would define the rest of his life. They finally entered the building, rode the elevator to the penthouse, while the security guard pretended not to notice them kissing like teenagers, and stepped into Zane's space that was already transforming into theirs. The moving crew had been efficient. Piper's clothes were hanging in half of Zane's massive walk-in closet, her toiletries arranged in the master bathroom, her books stacked on previously empty shelves waiting to be organized. Evidence of her presence scattered through the sterile masculine space, making it feel lived in and warm in ways it never had before. This is real, Zane said wonderingly, walking through the space like he was seeing it for the first time. You're actually here, actually staying, actually choosing this life with me. I'm choosing you, Piper corrected. The life is just what comes with the package. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. They ordered dinner from the Thai place Piper loved. Ate it sitting on Zane's obscenely expensive couch while watching a documentary about Arctic ecosystems that neither of them paid much attention to, and talked about logistics when they'd tell Piper's mother, how they'd handle office gossip, what furniture from her apartment she wanted to keep versus what could be donated or sold. Boring, practical, domestic conversation that felt more intimate than any of the desperate passion they'd shared before. At 11 p.m., exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the day, they went to bed not for sex, though there was plenty of kissing, but just to sleep wrapped around each other in Zane's massive bed that suddenly felt less empty and more like home. Piper drifted off with Zane's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and his hand stroking through her hair, and for the first time since this whole complicated situation began, she felt completely at peace. She was exactly where she belonged. No professional rules left to break. Just us, building something real. Saturday morning arrived with weak October sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the sound of Zane moving around the kitchen, attempting to make breakfast. Piper woke slowly, luxuriously, stretching in sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and feeling the pleasant ache of muscles that had been thoroughly used the night before, after the documentary had ended, and they'd migrated to the bedroom with considerably less innocent intentions. She found Zane in the kitchen wearing just pajama pants, his hair messed from sleep, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he frowned at a recipe on his tablet. The domesticity of the scene made her chest feel tight with affection. This powerful, dangerous man who commanded empires and inspired fear in hardened criminals, defeated by the challenge of making French toast. He should have walked away, but then he saw it. "You wear glasses," Piper said from the doorway, unable to hide her smile. Zane looked up, and his expression softened into something that looked almost bashful. "Only for reading. I'm slightly farsighted, happens with age. I usually wear contacts in public because the glasses don't project the image I'm going for." "What image is that?" "Terrifying and competent. The glasses make me look like a professor who's lost control of his freshman seminar." But he smiled as he said it, and Piper realized this was new. Zane letting her see the ordinary human underneath the carefully maintained exterior, trusting her with the small vulnerabilities he hid from everyone else. For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. "I like them," Piper said, crossing to him and wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "They make you look approachable, distinguished, like someone who might read poetry and drink tea instead of eliminating territorial threats and drinking scotch." "I do read poetry," Zane admitted. "Mostly late at night when I can't sleep. Neruda especially. I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees. That kind of thing." Piper felt her heart squeeze at the admission at this new facet of the man she'd chosen, discovering that beneath the ruthless executive was someone who read love poetry in the dark hours of morning when he thought no one would know. Zane Thorne reads Pablo Neruda, she said wonderingly. That's possibly the most romantic thing I've ever heard. Don't tell Axel, Zane said seriously. He'd never let me live it down. The boss who runs a criminal empire and secretly reads love poetry like a 16-year-old with his first crush. Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. Your secret's safe with me, Piper promised. On one condition, you read some to me sometime. When you can't sleep, instead of lying there alone, you wake me up and read me Neruda until we're both too exhausted to think. Zane turned in her arms, his eyes soft with emotion. Deal. Though I should warn you, most of Neruda's love poetry is intensely sexual. The cherry tree line is actually one of the tamer metaphors. Even better, Piper said, and kissed him until the French toast was forgotten, and they ended up back in bed where they stayed until early afternoon, learning each other with the kind of unhurried attention that came from having nowhere else to be and no reason to rush. They spent Saturday moving the rest of Piper's belongings, sorting through what to keep and what to donate, arguing good-naturedly about where her mismatched furniture would fit in Zane's carefully curated space. Maya came to help, bringing coffee and moral support, and endless commentary about how domestic they looked, how Zane seemed different, softer, more human, like someone had finally taught him how to smile with his whole face instead of just his mouth. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. You're good for him, Maya told Piper quietly, while Zane was downstairs helping load donation boxes into the truck. I've worked at that company for 4 years, and I've never seen him like this. Relaxed. Happy. Like he's finally figured out that empire building is less important than actually living. He's good for me too, Piper said honestly. He makes me feel brave enough to want things I thought were impossible, to take risks I would have talked myself out of, to believe that love is worth the complications. Sunday. They didn't leave the penthouse at all, ordered groceries delivered, spent hours cooking together in Zane's kitchen that he admitted he'd barely used before, made love on the couch and in the shower, and eventually back in bed where they belonged. It was perfect and ordinary and domestic, in ways that made Piper understand why Zane had been so desperate to have her there, because this was what he'd been missing for decades, this simple pleasure of sharing space with someone who made loneliness impossible. From here on, the rules of the game changed. Monday morning arrived too quickly, bringing with it the return to reality and the office where everyone would be watching, judging, speculating about the nature of their relationship. Piper dressed carefully in one of her professional dresses, but Zane shook his head when he saw her. Wear something of mine, he said, pulling a cashmere sweater from his closet, charcoal gray. Expensive, unmistakably his. I want everyone to see it and know. I want the territorial claim to be visible. That's very alpha male of you, Piper said. But she accepted the sweater, pulling it on over her dress and rolling up the sleeves. It was too big, drowning her frame, but it smelled like him, and the message was unmistakable. She belonged to Zane Thorne, and he wasn't hiding it. They drove to the office together in Zane's car, his hand on her thigh the entire ride, and when they pulled into the executive garage, he leaned over and kissed her thoroughly before they got out. Ready? He asked. Ready, Piper confirmed, though her stomach was twisting with anxiety about what awaited them. That moment, everything in the room changed. They entered the building together, rode the elevator to the executive floor, and stepped out hand in hand into the morning chaos of a Monday beginning. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Piper felt the weight of dozens of eyes tracking their movement as they walked through the corridor together, not hiding, not pretending, completely open about what they'd become to each other. Maya was waiting at Piper's old desk, except it wasn't Piper's desk anymore, not now that she reported to James Chen instead of Zane. Maya's eyes widened when she saw them together, saw Piper wearing Zane's sweater, saw the way his hand rested possessively on the small of her back as they navigated the office. You're really doing this, Maya said wonderingly. You're really just claiming each other in front of everyone. We really are, Piper confirmed. Is it causing problems? Is everyone talking? Everyone thought the deal went smoothly. But they were wrong. Everyone's talking, Maya admitted. But Piper, most of it's actually positive. People are saying you two look happy together, that you're good for him, that he seems more human than he has in years. So yeah, there's gossip, but it's not the malicious kind. It's mostly just people being surprised that the terrifying boss turned out to be capable of love. Zane had continued walking toward his office, and Piper followed, acutely aware of the attention tracking their movement. When they reached his door, he turned and pulled her close, kissing her in full view of everyone on the floor, A deliberate claim, a public declaration that she was his, and he was hers, and anyone who had opinions about it could deal with it or leave. "I'll see you at lunch," Zane murmured against her mouth. "My office. I'm not ready to share you with the cafeteria yet." "Possessive," Piper teased. "Always," Zane confirmed without apology. "Where you're concerned, I'll always be possessive. You've accepted that about me, remember?" In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. "I remember," Piper said, and kissed him once more, before reluctantly pulling away to head to James Chen's office, where she'd be working for the foreseeable future. The morning passed quickly, filled with the usual Monday chaos of emails and meetings and crisis management. But every hour, Piper's phone would buzz with a text from Zane, nothing important, just small check-ins that felt like digital caresses, reminders that he was thinking about her even when they were separated by floors and responsibilities. "Missing you already. This is going to be a very long day. Axel just made a joke about me being domesticated." I neither confirmed nor denied, but my expression apparently gave me away. 3 more hours until lunch. I'm counting down like a teenager waiting for prom. At noon, Piper made her way back to Zane's office to find him waiting with Thai food ordered from her favorite restaurant, and that soft expression she was learning to associate with moments when they were alone together. They ate lunch talking about their mornings, about the cases James Chen was assigning her, about the meetings Zane had endured where apparently his improved mood was noticeable enough that people kept asking if something good had happened. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. "Something good did happen," Zane said, pulling her into his lap despite the very professional setting. "The best thing. You happened. You chose me. You moved into my home and made it ours. You're wearing my sweater and letting everyone see that you're mine. That's not just something good, Piper. That's everything." At 2 p.m., as Piper was preparing to return to work, Axel appeared in the doorway without knocking, a liberty only he could take with Zane. His expression was amused but genuine as he looked between them. "I'm interrupting the lunch date," Axel observed. "My apologies, but I wanted to stop by and officially acknowledge what we all saw this morning. You two entering the building together, looking disgustingly happy, making it very clear that the boss is officially off the market and completely besotted with his former secretary. This choice would define the rest of his life." "She's not my former secretary," Zane corrected. "She still works here, just in a different reporting structure." "Semantics," Axel said with a wave. "The point is, I wanted to say congratulations. Genuinely. You both look happy in a way I've literally never seen either of you look before. Piper, you're good for him. He's smiling with his eyes now, not just his mouth, which is deeply unsettling but also kind of wonderful. And boss, Axel's expression grew more serious. You're good for her too. You look at her like she's the reason the sun rises, and that's exactly how she deserves to be looked at. So, yeah, congratulations. I'm happy for you both, even if watching you be domestically content is going to take some adjustment." "Thank you, Axel," Piper said sincerely, for pushing when Zane needed pushing, for making him face what he was too afraid to admit. "We wouldn't be here without your calculated meddling." What followed next was completely unexpected. "It was my pleasure," Axel said with a grin. Literally, watching the boss lose his mind over jealousy was the most entertaining thing that's happened in this organization in years. Though I'll admit, I'm relieved the drama's over, and we can all go back to normal operations without the sexual tension so thick it was interfering with productivity. He left with a mocking salute, and Piper found herself laughing despite the absurdity of the situation. "He's going to be impossible about this forever, isn't he?" "Absolutely," Zane confirmed. "But he's earned it. And more importantly, he's right. You are the reason the sun rises, Piper Lowen. You're the reason I wake up looking forward to the day instead of enduring it. You're the reason I finally understand what people mean when they talk about home being a person instead of a place." He had no idea the night would end in blood. Piper kissed him, slow and deep, pouring every ounce of love and gratitude and overwhelming emotion into the connection. "You're my home too," she whispered. "My impossible, complicated, occasionally terrifying home. And I wouldn't trade it for anything easier, or simpler, or less intense. This is exactly where I'm meant to be." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped around each other in Zane's office, while the city hummed below them, and their colleagues worked nearby and the world continued spinning. And Piper thought about the journey that had brought them here, from an accidental compliment that had shattered Zane's control to this moment of absolute certainty that they'd found something worth keeping. It was messy and complicated and probably inadvisable by every conventional standard. But it was also real and honest and built on a foundation of trust that had been hard-won through confrontation and vulnerability, and the willingness to risk everything for something that mattered more than safety. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. They'd claimed each other, publicly and completely. They'd established a partnership built on honesty instead of control. They'd proven that love could survive complications, that trust could be learned, that vulnerability was strength instead of weakness. And as Piper finally left Zane's office to return to her work, she looked back to find him watching her with that soft expression that was becoming familiar. Love and possession and desperate gratitude all mixed together into something that made her feel more precious than any empire he could have built. "No professional rules left to break," Zane called after her, echoing the words that had become their private promise. "No professional rules left to break," Piper confirmed, smiling over her shoulder. "Just us, building something real. From here on, the rules of the game changed. And that was exactly what they'd do, build something real, something lasting, something worth the risk they'd taken by choosing each other despite every reasonable objection. Together, always, forever."